On the 18th of December 1987, a Japanese video game publisher called Square released a game that they hoped would revive their ailing fortunes and lift them up from the ashes of mediocrity. It was by no means a last resort, but for some time Square had been adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Few of their games had fostered any kind of lasting appeal, and their search for the answer highlighted just how much they were struggling to find their feet in the ever-evolving landscape of the Japanese video gaming industry. This new game would be their anchor, a foundation upon which they could build and grow, and following its initial success, countless spin-offs and sequels would be spawned, each one building upon the rich legacy of that original game. As of March 2022, that legacy stands to the tune of over 173 million copies being sold, something that has solidified the franchise amongst a pantheon of gaming greats. That anchor had become entrenched and immovable, allowing Square and subsequently Square Enix to become a juggernaut within the video gaming industry. But it all began with that fateful release back in December of 1987, with a game that was simply called Final Fantasy. By 1987, Square had become an established publisher and developer of video games in Japan. They had found initial success on personal computers, producing numerous text-based adventure games. Cruise Chaser Blasty and Alpha would serve as shining examples. Each pushed boundaries, bringing something new to market. But after witnessing the continued success of Nintendo's family computer, the company was encouraged to move away from the tried and tested. The only challenge was that they lacked the experience to do so in an effective manner. Square had become accustomed to creating games that suited a more mature audience, but the Famicom was attracting an audience that was younger and more vibrant. And the types of games that appealed to this new audience were not text-based adventures or early role-playing games. They were high-octane, action-based experiences that could satisfy the cravings of this younger audience and give them the arcade experience from their living rooms. In spite of this, the employees at Square were undeterred. They had faced challenges before, and a belief was instilled that there was every chance a silver bullet of a game could be made, and that this game would help them to realize the potential for huge financial returns associated with developing games for the Famicom. Square signed on with Nintendo as a Famicom developer on the 24th of June 1985. This made them something of a trailblazer, as they were one of the first Japanese developers to sign with Nintendo. But it would take some time until Square were ready to truly commit to the system. One of the main challenges was that Square's personal computer games had seen a dramatic upturn in performance. Their first game, called The Death Trap, was created by a group of part-time employees with Hironobu Sakaguchi at the helm. It would end up generating around $120,000 upon its release in October of 1984, and its success would prompt the production of a sequel. Again overseen by Sakaguchi, Will, The Death Trap 2 featured the same core gameplay and narrative premise, but this time the scope was much more ambitious. Square went heavy on graphical innovation, and it's believed that The Death Trap 2 became Japan's first animated PC game when it launched during the middle of 1985. These technical features, when combined with a new approach to product marketing, would see The Death Trap 2 end up generating approximately $2.4 million, a 1,900% increase in revenue compared to its predecessor. With The Death Trap 2 launching around the same time as the agreement had been signed with Nintendo, Square's plans to develop for the Famicom were placed on hold. They would still support the system, releasing a port of Thexter, but most of the newfound capital was used to further invest in producing games for personal computers. It saw skilled freelancers hired to either support existing staff or replace those that fell by the wayside, and partnerships were explored to further elevate the quality of the games they were producing. Cruise Chaser Blasty and Alpha served as evidence for this new vision. For Cruise Chaser Blasty, Square would collaborate with a respected animation house called Nippon Sunrise. and due to the scale of the initiative, Square even adapted the story into a manga and planned to release an original video animation to further expand the universe. For Sakaguchi, this was also a first opportunity to showcase his interest in the role-playing genre, as instead of making another adventure game, Cruise Chaser Blasty was created as a first-person role-playing game based around mechs. For Alpha, which would be overseen by a close friend of Sakaguchi called Hiromichi Tanaka, Square would continue to evolve the quality of their interactive text-based adventures. It would see time and money invested in cutting-edge technology, with the final product combining complex animations, sound effects, and music to create a dynamic and engaging video game. Both games would be well received, helping Square to consolidate their position as an up-and-coming video game developer and publisher. And to ensure their trajectory continued to move in the right direction, 3 crucial decisions were made. Prominent staff members, such as Sakaguchi and Tanaka, were rewarded with full-time contracts. The office would be moved from Hiyoshi to Ginza, an upscale part of Tokyo, and they would start developing meaningful games for the Famicom. These steps showed Square's ambitions, but there was one slight issue. When the deal had been signed with Nintendo, Square were reportedly the 7th company to do so. Fast forward a year later, and 26 separate publishers had produced games for the Famicom, with the majority of them, outside of a few outliers like Square, managing to release at least 2 games. Whereas Square had waited, these publishers had seen the opportunity and attempted to take full advantage. As a result, Square were left playing catch-up. But even still, there was a confidence within the company that they would be able to wrestle market share away from their competitors by producing compelling, arcade-based experiences. And to ensure they had the best chance of success, for their first Famicom game, which would be called King's Knight, they assigned some of their top talent. It would see Hironobu Sakaguchi assigned as director, with Kazuko Shibuya and Hiromi Ito assigned to work on the artistic vision. Nobuo Uematsu would then be assigned as the composer, and due to a lack of experience working on the Famicom, Square collaborated with Works, a third-party development company who had previously worked with them on the Famicom port of Thexter. To ensure King's Knight would resonate with the Famicom audience, instead of building on their experience with slower, more methodical games, the plan was to create a vertical scrolling shooter. And the reason for this was simple. The scrolling shooter genre had seen a huge boost in popularity throughout the early 1980s thanks to Japanese arcades, and that popularity had spilled over to the Famicom. This had been led by a range of ports, with 1942 and Twin B both selling over 1 million copies each. And publishers had started to produce Famicom exclusive games in the genre, often based on existing IPs. Even though they didn't have a license to leverage, Square's leadership believed that if they could create a compelling vertical scrolling shooter, success would be easier to achieve. But Sakaguchi didn't just want to create a derivative experience. At the time, many shooters were either based within a modern-day war setting or a futuristic space setting. Neither subgenre was all that appealing to Sakaguchi, but when looking for alternative sources of inspiration, a game called Nightmare stood out. Unlike its contemporaries, Nightmare was set within ancient Greece. As such, instead of using guns and lasers, its protagonist would shoot arrows and use swords. Upon launch, Nightmare would be lauded, with many publications recommending it to their readers due to its innovative visuals and overall quality of gameplay. And due to how well it was received, there was a feeling that it would serve as the perfect blueprint for Sakaguchi's vision for what a vertical scrolling shooter should be. It would see a similar style of gameplay adopted, but for King's Knight, a broader cast of characters would be created. Sakaguchi would also layer over role-playing mechanics, something that facilitated the creation of a brand new genre that was dubbed the Formation RPG. This decision further emphasized Sakaguchi's desire to create role-playing games. But with King's Knight not being well received by critics or fans, the leadership team at Square would end up pushing Sakaguchi to be more direct with subsequent games. Beyond that, even though Sakaguchi did have a desire to make a more complete role-playing game, neither he nor close members of his team had the required technical know-how in order to make it happen. At the time, Famicom cartridges did not have any kind of method for saving data, and there was a belief that role-playing games, due to how long their stories were and how long gameplay sessions can end up being, would need some kind of method for saving. Otherwise, players would get frustrated by not being able to pick up where they left off. As such, Sakaguchi had no real choice but to tackle other action-based genres such as the rail shooter and driving simulator, And although there was still room for innovation, this would come in the form of technical aspects as opposed to intricate gameplay mechanics. As Sakaguchi toiled away trying to make a smash hit for the Famicom, other minds in the company were hard at work creating games for the Famicom disk system. Nintendo had developed this peripheral as a way of helping to reduce the retail price of games, taking direct inspiration from personal computers. It would see the initial system have a hefty price tag, but the games themselves would retail at about half the price of a typical Famicom game. It would also be possible to buy blank discs, which could then be taken into stores to have brand new games loaded onto them for as little as 500 yen. For consumers, this was a game changer. Brand new games could now be purchased for 90% less than the typical retail price, and the hope was that by removing the price tag, it would lead to increased demand. Publishers flocked to take advantage, and with the storage and medium being much more familiar to Square, instead of waiting around like they had done with the Famicom, they went all in immediately. Such was the level of Square's commitment that multiple games were planned for development. They even founded and helmed the Disk Original Group, a publishing arm that would see them distribute games on the Famicom disk system for similar-sized Japanese developers such as Crystal Soft, System Sarcom, and Hummingbird Soft. The first game released by Square for the Famicom disk system would be Crystal Dragon. It was helmed by Hiromichi Tanaka, and by leveraging all the experience Tanaka and his team had gained from developing adventure games for personal computers, as well as aggressive traditional and guerrilla marketing campaigns, Crystal Dragon would end up selling over 500,000 copies. Shortly after launch, another employee at Square called Kazuhiko Aoki started work on an ambitious project that was meant to be called Seiken Densetsu: The Emergence of Excalibur. Deciding to take a big chance, Aoki planned Seiken Densetsu as a party-based role-playing game despite not being given full permission to do so. The story was planned to be rooted in high fantasy, with players taking control of a party that consisted of 4 interchangeable characters. The scale of the game was also planned to be beyond anything seen before. And having become enthused by all of this, Square's publicity department launched an advertising campaign before development had even started, during which it was revealed that the game would come on 5 discs, something that would have seen Seiken Densetsu releasing as the largest game ever produced for the Famicom disk system. Unfortunately, once members of the senior management team took a closer look at the project, instead of asking Aoki to scale back the vision, they chose the drastic action of cancelling the game outright before any significant progress was made. The fate of Seiken Densetsu was emblematic of the wider sentiment towards role-playing games within Square. There were developers, such as Sakaguchi and Aoki, who adored the genre and wanted to explore and experiment with possibilities. But there were others within the management layer who felt that creating role-playing games would not be a prudent financial decision. They instead believed that players wanted fast-paced action games, and the Famicom bestsellers list supported that view. By mid-1986, 35 games had sold more than 1 million copies on the Famicom. In the early years, the majority of these had been published by Nintendo, but as time went on, third-party publishers had begun to step out from Nintendo's shadow. It would see companies such as Hudson Soft, Capcom, and Konami release now iconic games such as Bomberman, Ghosts and Goblins, and Gradius. And even though the literal genre differed, they all had a strong focus towards action. Bomberman, for example, was an action puzzle game. Ghosts and Goblins was a 2D action platformer, and Gradius was a horizontal side-scrolling shooter, the very epitome of action. These games highlighted the general trend, and it would be further emphasized by games like The Legend of Zelda and Hydralide. Neither game had been designed with the Famicom in mind, with The Legend of Zelda releasing in Japan on the Famicom disk system, and Hydralide being ported over from personal computers. But they each showed that the action genre could be fused together with the adventure and role-playing genres to create compelling experiences. It also showed that developers who had the opportunity to take risks would be rewarded, but with Square seeing diminishing returns from their support of the Famicom disk system, they chose to focus their efforts on initiatives that they believed would reduce the risk as much as possible. As such, they focused on creating adventure games for the Famicom disk system, explored the creation of licensed games, and kept the Famicom as their platform ace in the hole, where they would experiment but in a controlled manner. After the publishing of King's Knight, this saw Sakaguchi oversee the creation of a rail shooter called Operation Jumpout and a racing game called Highway Star. But while the team toiled away on these new efforts, something quite unexpected was happening within the Japanese video games industry. On the 27th of May 1986, an unorthodox publisher by the name of Enix had gone to market with a game called Dragon Quest. Unlike other publishers who often published games developed by their own internal teams or select partners, Enix operated on a more fluid model. They would instead ask the Japanese public for ideas through competitions, offering cash prizes for the winners. The first major run of this concept saw over 300 programming hobbyists submit ideas. 13 were successful, with Enix publishing them all within the same window. But amongst those 13, 2 stood out. The first, a puzzle platformer called Door Door, was submitted by a 19-year-old individual named Koichi Nakamura. Enix paid Nakamura 500,000 yen for the submission, and with it going on to sell over 200,000 copies, it granted Nakamura access to a sizable amount of royalties. The second, a tennis simulation game called Love Match Tennis, was presented by a 29-year-old individual named Yuji Horii, a freelance writer for Weekly Shonen Jump. For coming first in the competition, Horii was paid 1 million yen, the equivalent of 5,000 US dollars. Following this initial wave of releases, both Nakamura and Horii would continue to work with Enix. Later that same year, they collaborated to create the Bortopia Serial Murder Case, an innovative and influential visual novel that would even inspire the likes of Hideo Kojima to want to make games. Nakamura would then found his own development studio called Chunsoft in 1984, but Enix would continue the relationship, and this would lead to another collaboration with Horii that would end up becoming one of the most influential Japanese video games of all time, Dragon Quest. Keen to continue innovating, Enix decided to send Nakamura and Horii to Apple Fest, a North American conference dedicated to all things Apple. Many Western developers would showcase their latest games, and Enix hoped that the pair would gain exposure to new ways of thinking. The trip would have the desired effect, as 2 franchises stood out, Wizardry and Ultima. Both games had made waves throughout the early 1980s, with each franchise having 3 entries within the first 3 years of the decade. But even though they were developed for the Apple II, and both Horii and Nakamura had specialized in making games for Japanese personal computers, the pair were intrigued by the Famicom and decided to take a big risk. At the time, role-playing games weren't all that popular in Japan, and they were certainly not popular on home consoles. This in itself represented a real challenge, as they would be pushing against the supposed demands of the market. But Horii felt as though Japanese gamers deserved the chance to experience the thrills that Western role-playing games offered, and he set about attempting to figure out how they could create a more Japanese-centric adaptation of the genre. Throughout the initial planning, Horii was adamant that Dragon Quest should deviate away from some of the already released role-playing games by becoming more accessible. They wanted it to be enjoyable for anyone who owned a Famicom and was curious, as opposed to being restricted to only being enjoyable by the so-called hardcore gamers of the time. They also wanted to create a very clear distinction between arcade action-focused ports that had proliferated onto the system, which were designed to make players have frequent game overs. Based on this, Horii vowed to make a game where players could enjoy long play sessions without having to worry about seeing a game over screen, something that would be complemented by a simple control scheme that would make use of a command-based menu system. They also hired an artist to create promotional and in-game assets as well as the box art, as they believed this would help the game feel more cool and approachable. That artist would be Akira Toriyama, who at the time was a rising star, having started to gain some renown for his work on a relatively new manga called Dragon Ball. Upon its release though, Enix's worst fears were realised. Dragon Quest did not resonate with the Japanese public, and initial sales were so low that there were fears that Enix would even make a loss. In response, Horii went on the charm offensive with the Japanese public, writing a string of articles in Shonen Jump magazine aimed at explaining the concept of role-playing games. Those who were then intrigued enough to purchase found themselves hooked, and over the next 6 to 9 months, the combination of new articles and word of mouth helped Dragon Quest to overcome its slump and become a must-have game for the Famicom. Fast forward 1 year, and Dragon Quest had managed to sell more than 1.5 million copies, becoming one of the best-selling games on the system. And it not only proved from a technical perspective that it was possible for role-playing games to be made on the Famicom, it also proved that they could sell, and sell well. The success of Dragon Quest was just what Sakaguchi needed. He had been enjoying Western role-playing games for some time, as had other members of the team at Square, but due to a combination of factors, even though attempts had been made to produce the type of role-playing game he himself would want to play, there was limited appetite within Square to be proactive in supporting the production of this type of game, and this was especially true following their decision to shift their focus towards developing for the Famicom. However, towards the start of 1987, there became a realization amongst the Square's management team that things were not going as well as they had hoped. This realization led to certain barriers being broken down, and it presented an opportunity that Sakaguchi would attempt to seize with significant gusto. Within a few short years, Square had produced a whole host of video games and made a lot of money. This had then been used to hire a raft of full-time employees and invest in high-end office space within one of the most exclusive business districts in Tokyo. But despite the huge levels of investment, Square's revenue did not increase in any kind of meaningful way. To turn around their fortunes, the president of Square, a man named Masafumi Miyamoto, made an intriguing decision. He decided, in principle, to divide the company into 4 teams. But in the initial instance, each team would only consist of one person, a team leader. It would be their responsibility to come up with a compelling game concept and present it to the entire company, which by this point consisted of around 50 people. The teams would then be formed by using a democratic system, as each employee would be given the freedom to choose the idea that they wanted to work on. As one of the chosen team leaders, Sakaguchi thought hard about what to present. For some time, he had been wanting to build a compelling role-playing game, but after the company shifted focus towards the Famicom, this was considered impossible. That was, until the release of Dragon Quest. It not only shattered preconceived notions around the technical limitations of the Famicom, but proved that role-playing games could be a huge commercial success on the system. With Dragon Quest II surpassing the original in almost every way, Sakaguchi felt the time was right for Square to tackle a role-playing game themselves. And so, he presented his vision for a role-playing game to the entire company, declaring that their ambition should be to knock Dragon Quest from its perch. After seeing the presentations, only 3 people decided to support Sakaguchi's vision. Due to how successful Dragon Quest had become, the rest felt that Sakaguchi's ambitions were just too bold, bordering on arrogant and disrespectful. The majority instead chose to support the game presented by Hiromichi Tanaka, which proposed creating a side-scrolling action game based on the Alien movie franchise. This was not an ideal start, but the seed had at least been planted. And even though Sakaguchi was able to only convince a few people that a compelling and successful role-playing game could be made on the Famicom, that was still better than convincing no people. After the dust settled, Sakaguchi and his small team were relocated to another building, a warehouse with just 2 rooms. Here, instead of working on the role-playing game that Sakaguchi had presented to the company, the majority of the team started working on Highway Star, an arcade-style racing game that was more in line with what the leadership at Square were wanting to see at the time. However, not everyone was assigned by Sakaguchi to work on Highway Star. An individual called Koichi Ishii was separated from the rest of the team, tasked with doing initial planning on the role-playing game, and while he occupied one of the rooms by himself, even creating a makeshift cubicle out of some foldable conference tables to make it feel more professional, everyone else was crammed into the other room to work on Highway Star. This was a real sink-or-swim moment for Ishii. Having joined Square towards the end of 1986, Ishii had very little experience within the video games industry, and he almost didn't even proceed through the interview process, as Sakaguchi was quite shocked to see someone turn up looking like a thug, wearing a leather jacket with peacock-like feathers attached. But Ishii turned out to be the very literal manifestation of not judging a book by its cover. As the interview progressed, Ishii showed Sakaguchi his notebook. Inside were tons of cute character drawings and wondrous concepts. They blew Sakaguchi away, and he became convinced that what Ishii lacked in experience, he would make up for with creativity. After being assigned to work on the role-playing game, Ishii was more than aware of the scale of the task ahead. After all, Dragon Quest had been a monumental success, and Sakaguchi wanted this new game to try and take its place as the king of the hill. Having already played Dragon Quest and other games in similar adjacent genres like The Legend of Zelda, Wizardry and Ultima, Ishii's first task was to establish what he liked and disliked about each of those games. Alongside this, Ishii also began to formalize the many ideas and illustrations that had found their way into his notebooks over the years, and he thoroughly enjoyed figuring out how these would translate into a digital format. One of the ideas that had featured with a high degree of prominence focused on 5 elements, and how they should be integrated into a world where supernatural beings were prevalent. The idea was to introduce 4 elements that were grounded in reality, and these would be enriched through the medium of fantasy. The 5th element was then planned to be something unconventional, but after careful consideration, this 5th element, which was meant to be dubbed mana, was removed. The 4 elements that remained would become associated with crystals, and they would end up becoming a focal point of the narrative. They would provide an impetus for the 4 protagonists, guiding their journey around the world to fight 4 powerful bosses, each of whom guarded much larger crystals. Alongside this, Ishii introduced a suite of design concepts that would be retained as development commenced, such as creating a diorama-inspired world map, the introduction of a title card that would show the game's prologue had concluded, and that the game's first boss, Garland, should also be the game's final boss. Another important decision would relate to the battle system. Many of the popular role-playing games, irrespective of where they had been developed in the world, had either seen combat play out in the field or in a separate first-person battle scene. Ishii felt this was restrictive, and instead proposed a side-on view that would allow players to see their entire party on one side of the screen and the array of enemies they were facing on the other. This decision would allow for more spotlight to be placed on a simplified class system, as each job, as they would become known, would have a unique visual style. And by having a side-on approach, players would see how their formation stacked up against that of their enemy. By the time Highway Star was wrapping up, Ishii had been working for a few months on the role-playing concepts. Some solid foundations had been created, but there were numerous challenges ahead. Even still, Sakaguchi was incredibly driven to make this project succeed, and wanted to be as efficient as possible with the remaining time they had. For years, it had been his dream to make video games, but neither King's Knights nor Operation Jumpout were games that played to his strengths as a creator. With both titles struggling from both a critical and commercial perspective, and Highway Star suffering a similar fate, Sakaguchi made a promise to himself. Unless this next game performed well enough to prove that he had what it took to make it within the video games industry, he would quit, return to university, and get a more sensible job. With the team being so small, it became a necessity for everyone to chip in, irrespective of their strengths and weaknesses. They just had to make it work. As Sakaguchi would later share, the mentality of the team at the time was that there was no guarantee this game would make it. There were a lot of worries, a lot of unstable factors going into this project. The notion of mucking in was evidenced everywhere. It meant that despite Kazuko Shibuya being the designated artist within the team, Ishii, for example, learnt how to do pixel art so that he could help out, and this led to him also working on creating the user interface. To create something compelling, he created thick borders around the menu boxes using the iron pipes from Mario Bros. As an inspiration. It would also be Ishii who came up with the now famed white glove cursor, which was inspired by a game called Crackout. But as talented and driven as the team was, they also knew when limits had been reached, and there was a feeling that if the game were to stand out and be seen as a genuine competitor to Dragon Quest, external help would be required to enhance existing skill sets and create something unique. The two major areas that this applied to were the narrative and the artistic direction. Sakaguchi had worked on numerous narratives during his time at Square, but his role would vary. Sometimes he would come up with the wider concepts and work with writers to help formalize those concepts into something coherent, while other times he would take ownership of the entire process. For this game, Sakaguchi decided it would be best to seek external help, so they commissioned a professional writer called Kenji Terada and tasked him with taking the concepts created by both Ishii and Sakaguchi and incorporating them into a compelling narrative. Beyond this, even though Shibuya had become the go-to person for sprite work at Square and was an incredible artist in her own right, Ishii felt that they needed something more. They needed an illustrator. Ishii had been studying illustration for some time, using them as a source of inspiration, and outside of artists such as Rodney Matthews and Roger Hildebrandt, Ishii would almost always come back to a Japanese artist called Yoshitaka Amano. Amano was nothing short of an artistic prodigy. From a young age, he just wanted to draw, and such was his fascination with drawing that he didn't want his creativity to be burdened by rules and regulations. It saw Amano reject the opportunity to attend formal art classes, as he instead wanted to learn and explore by taking his own path. This path would see him join the prestigious Tatsunoko Productions at the tender age of just 15 years old, and such was his talent that the head of Tatsunoko Productions, Tatsuo Yoshida, would end up being his mentor. Amano would end up staying at the company for over a decade, but even though he was given a chance to work on franchises such as Speed Racer and Gatchaman and enjoyed his work, the creative drive inside led to him yearning for something else. It saw Amano start to explore with more experimental art styles, and he became inspired by Western artists such as Frank Frazetta, who had created awe-inspiring covers for comic books. Years of study led to Amano becoming convinced his future lay elsewhere, and so, after leaving Tatsunoko Productions, he became a freelance illustrator. It wouldn't take long for someone to recognize his talent, and Amano was hired to work on Vampire Hunter D. Alongside this, he also started to release books that contained his works, and one of the first, called Maten, would end up leaving a lasting impression on Ishii. When thinking about illustrators, Ishii therefore recommended to Sakaguchi that they speak to Amano, but having no clue who Amano was, Sakaguchi rejected the notion, as he wanted to hire an artist of great renown, much like Enix had done when they commissioned Akira Toriyama to work on Dragon Quest. After searching on his own, Sakaguchi found an artist he thought would fit the bill. That artist turned out to be Amano. Soon after, Sakaguchi sent a proposal to Amano, and then proceeded to visit his studio with Ishii and Shibuya to discuss what it would be like to work on a video game. It just so happened that even though Amano was unfamiliar with Square and was tentative about working on video games, he did want to work with fantasy as a theme. With the deal signed, the team at Square thought hard about how they wanted Amano to contribute to the project. They didn't want to place too many restrictions so as to not inhibit creativity, but one aspect was stressed. To differentiate Final Fantasy from Dragon Quest, the artwork had to cater to adults as opposed to children. To ensure this mature theme was consistent, Amano would be tasked with providing artwork for the game's box art and manual, but perhaps his most important role related to the creation of a plethora of illustrations that Ishii and Shibuya could then use as a reference for creating pixel art in-game. By this point, the project was starting to gain some traction, and when other projects at Square finished up, staff members were more than keen to see how they could contribute. At various points, it would see the likes of Akitoshi Kawazu, Hiroyuki Ito, and Ken Narita join, and they would each make significant contributions. Kawazu, for example, leveraged his experience playing and creating tabletop role-playing games while at university. He would create the underlying gameplay mechanics that would bring Ishii's character classes to life. Ito, whose main role was debugging, would also end up having a direct impact on the turn-based battle system. After seeing the side-on view concept created by Ishii, he felt it resembled a typical NFL match, where the opposing sides would square off against each other, making all their tactical decisions before the play started. Narita would then be joined by Kiyoshi Yoshi to program the entire battle system, something that involved implementing the detailed design specifications provided by Kawazu and Ito. And this would be an interesting distinction, as the involvement of Narita and Yoshi on the battle system allowed Nasir Jebeli, Sakaguchi's main programmer, to focus elsewhere. For all of Nasir's talents, having worked so long on action-based games, he struggled to understand many of the concepts relating to role-playing games. And with there being a language barrier, as Nasir only spoke limited Japanese, Sakaguchi struggled to find a way to explain these concepts in a way that made sense. One prominent example was that Nasir couldn't understand the concept of hit points. In his mind, if someone got hit, they should die immediately, or at least lose a life. It meant that even though Nasir was brilliant, using Japanese programmers for these particular elements proved to be much more efficient. Nasir was then tasked with working on the programming for everything else, and that task would end up being massive in scale. It would see Nasir not only have to figure out how to make proper use of all the visual assets and how the various scenes would connect, but he would also be responsible for doing manual coding of every single line of dialogue and every single cutscene animation. Nasir also pushed boundaries and even went rogue at times. It was through his innovations that the airship functioned in such an effective manner, as he figured out a way to have the screen move 4 times the speed without there being any kind of performance reduction. And beyond that, Nasir also had time to program the secret 15 puzzle minigame that not even Sakaguchi knew about, as well as an anti-piracy script that was able to detect attempts to adjust the source code and render the product inoperable. Each of these elements helped to make this project into something that was starting to feel quite special. And after seeing what was being created, more and more staff members wanted to join. Even Hiromichi Tanaka would join after finishing up with a game called The Cursed Treasure of Cleopatra, as would Takashi Tokita. Towards the end, it would see there being 3 programmers, 4 planners, 4 artists, and 5 other people working in supporting areas. And perhaps one of the most notable in this realm would be the game's composer, Noboru Uematsu. Uematsu had been working with Square since the release of Cruise Chaser Blasty, but before that, he had been struggling to make ends meet as a musician. By today's standards, Uematsu was a late bloomer, with his interest in musical instruments only coming at the age of 12. In the following years, that interest blossomed into something else, and it led to a teenage Uematsu growing aspirations to become a professional musician, even wanting to study music at university. But, as it was deemed an undesirable career, his parents refused to let him go down that path. As an act of defiance, even though Uematsu respected this decision, choosing to study foreign languages instead, he chose to study almost 500 miles away at Kanagawa University. And he did so with the explicit purpose of continuing to pursue music outside of his studies. After graduating, Uematsu chose to stay in the area, producing numerous demo reels for prospective publishing houses, and after some luck, this relentlessness ended up landing him a part-time position at Square. After impressing on a few projects like Cruise Chaser Blasty and Alpha, Uematsu was retained as a full-time employee, and with his focus now clear, he worked alongside Toshiaki Imai to produce music for almost every single game they made thereon after. Often, the scores Uematsu produced would only contain a handful of pieces of music, but due to the scale of this new game, not only was there an expectation that the volume of music would increase, there was also an expectation that the quality would need to increase too. And as Sakaguchi himself had been an aspiring musician who had also been dissuaded from following that career path by his parents, he had a particular focus on this area. By the end of production, Uematsu had composed countless pieces of music, with over 20 being deemed strong enough to make the final cut. One of these would be a last-minute request from Sakaguchi, and it would simply become known as the Prelude. Due to this request coming right at the end of production, it needed to be completed with the utmost haste. Uematsu took this in the most literal of senses, composing the Prelude in just 10 minutes. That such a compelling and enduring piece of music was composed in such a short amount of time epitomized the sheer talent that Uematsu possessed. And even though he would often be at odds with Sakaguchi, with them having constructive discussions about the quality and quantity of the work that Uematsu composed, it would be hard to argue with the end result. As each piece of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that the game would be a captivating and meaningful experience. But there was still one major problem to solve: what the game should be called. The only thing they knew was that the game needed to be based on alliteration. This particular concept for naming games had been used quite a few times within Square itself, but also with third-party titles where Square served as the publisher. Prominent examples of this would be King's Knight, Deep Dungeon, and Rad Racer, the name used for Highway Star's North American release. Outside of these names sounding cool in their own right, the development team also wanted consumers to be able to shorten the name to just 2 syllables, not least because this was what had happened with Dragon Quest, which was often shortened to either Draqua or DQ. With Square having already used the letters D, K, and R, they decided to work with the letter F because they wanted to use the word fantasy. After some deliberation, they felt the name Fighting Fantasy would work quite well. Not only would this allow consumers to shorten the game down to the cool-sounding FF, they also believed it would lead to them referring to the game as Fi-Fan. With the name decided, the legal team started doing their due diligence, but they came back soon after with unfortunate news. 4 years earlier, a gamebook series called Fighting Fantasy had been created, subsequently taking the world by storm. The first 3 books were so popular within the UK that they occupied numerous spots at the same time within the Sunday Times' children's book chart, and by 1987, over 8 million copies had been sold worldwide. Due to the similar themes between the 2 properties, there was no way Square would be able to use the name without coming into some kind of legal trouble, but they also didn't want to budge too much. This meant they would keep the alliteration around the letter F, and they would also keep the word fantasy, as they wanted it to be front and center in the name as a descriptor of what the product represented. After looking at numerous options, the first word ended up being changed to final. This would be apt, as Sakaguchi had vowed to make this his final game should it underperform, and there was also a feeling that Square as a company were on a negative trajectory. But it was not meant to be all that symbolic. Instead, the primary reason they chose the name Final Fantasy was that it sounded really cool. As development continued into the fourth quarter of 1987, Square started to increase their marketing efforts as they built up for launch. This saw numerous methods of advertising utilized, and within print publications, emphasis was placed on the involvement of Terada, Amano, and Nasir, as they were influential figures whose professional works pushed into different consumer demographics. Alongside this, and to ensure that no stone was left unturned, Square also employed some more unorthodox approaches towards driving pre-orders. For example, a letter was sent to everyone who had pre-ordered Seiken Densetsu. Its intention was to inform them of the game's cancellation, but there was also a significant amount of space dedicated to selling them on why they might want to switch their pre-order over to Final Fantasy instead, as it would also be a narrative-focused role-playing game with an emphasis on building a party. As marketing efforts continued, the next questions related to when the game should release and how many copies should be produced. The latent success of Dragon Quest shocked numerous video game publishers and developers across Japan, and when Dragon Quest II released just 8 months later, they were shocked again. Unlike its predecessor, which had taken some time to win over the Japanese public, Dragon Quest II sold 500,000 copies at launch. This made Enix 2.75 billion yen overnight. And due to the nature of the success, many of the traditional and challenger publishers who had continued to create games in tried and tested genres had their eyes well and truly opened. Sakaguchi had sensed this shift, but so too had many other creatives in Japan, and one of the first publishers to act would be Namco. Amongst the plentiful group of third-party publishers to have created games for the Famicom, Namcot, a subsidiary of Namco, were part of the elite. They had published countless games, with 2 of them even going on to sell over 1 million copies each, and their formula for success had been quite simple: focus on action. This would often see them port over games that had been successful within the arcades, but they would also fuse action with other genres, even experimenting with a few action role-playing games such as the Tower of Duraga, which is noted for inspiring the likes of The Legend of Zelda and Hydelide. In 1987, their approach started to shift. They would still focus on action-based games, but Namcot realized that interest was waning around classic arcade ports. As a result, they chose to focus more on sports games. They also developed slower experiences, including Family Mahjong and Sanma the Great Detective, a board game and adventure game respectively. Namcot would also publish Dragon Slayer 4 despite not having worked with Nihon Falcom on the previous 3 installments. But perhaps their most intriguing move would relate to a game created in collaboration with a newly formed development studio called Atlas. Following its release in 1986, a science fiction novel series, Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, had become a huge hit. Keen to strike while the iron was hot, its author, Aya Nishitani, worked with the publishing house Tokuma Shoten on facilitating the creation of multimedia adaptations. The initial plan was for Nintendo to produce a video game for the Famicom, but even though it received provisional approval, the board of directors at Nintendo vetoed the plan due to the source material being deemed far too mature for their brand. It was subsequently offered to other interested parties, and 2 groups won out: Atlas, who applied through Namco, and Telenet Japan. It would see 2 video game adaptations of Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei created. Atlas and Namco would work on a game for the Famicom, while Telenet Japan would create one for personal computers. And to keep things interesting and ensure expectations were subverted, the 2 parties agreed that not only should the 2 games be quite different, they should be the opposite of what each respective player base would expect. This meant the Famicom version would be a traditional role-playing game that drew heavy inspiration from wizardry, while the version created for personal computers would have a stronger focus on action. At the same time, the likes of Hudson Soft had also laid down plans for the creation of traditional role-playing games, as had smaller publishers such as Hotbee and Kenko. This meant that the latter part of 1987 became a hotbed for console role-playing games, especially as publishers were desperate to release before Dragon Quest III, which had been scheduled for the first part of 1988. Released in September of 1987, Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei led what became a new wave of console role-playing games. 3 other games then released in October, and Final Fantasy would be planned to release in mid-December, just 2 days before another intriguing role-playing game produced by Sega called Phantasy Star. This meant there was enough opportunity for Final Fantasy to stand out, but by also releasing a little bit later than those other 4 Famicom games, it allowed consumers to not only become more familiar with role-playing games, but also create some kind of benchmark outside of Dragon Quest. In this regard, the development team at Square felt that Final Fantasy was destined to land well with consumers. And as more and more people joined the project, this sentiment only continued to grow. But even though the development team had high hopes, the management team were unsure how much that confidence would translate into actual sales, and it led to many heated discussions about how many copies of Final Fantasy should be ordered for its initial shipment. One of the main sticking points around that shipment number was the performance of Sakaguchi's 2 previous games, Operation Jumpout and Highway Star. Both games were aligned with popular genres and employed advanced technology such as stereoscopic 3D graphics. Square believed this would be appealing and ordered hundreds of thousands of copies for each game, but neither would live up to expectations, and unsold copies that took up space in Square's warehouse would serve as a constant reminder. The other main issue was Square themselves. Due to a combination of poor management and games underperforming upon release, the company's financial position had become precarious. To ensure they did not overextend and make the situation worse, the decision was taken to order 200,000 copies of Final Fantasy. Upon learning this, Sakaguchi was said to have been livid. For many months, he had lived and breathed Final Fantasy, pouring his heart and soul into the game. After all, if this was to be his swan song within the video games industry, he wanted to go out with a bang, selling as many copies as possible. He had recommended that 500,000 copies be ordered, but after learning that Square were only willing to bankroll 200,000, less than half of his recommendation, he would end up taking an incredible course of action. Instead of continuing to argue with his superiors at Square, Sakaguchi took a near-finished version of the game and showed it to rival publishers, one of which was Shueisha, the famed publishing house who, amongst other things, were responsible for the very popular Shonen Jump magazine. After learning what was happening, the management team at Square decided to be pragmatic. Instead of admonishing Sakaguchi for his unethical actions, they instead took the opposite stance, as they believed it served as the ultimate testament for how much passion and belief there was in the product. And although they did not choose to order 500,000 copies, at least not right away, they compromised and committed to ordering 400,000. Development on Final Fantasy would wrap in September of 1987, and that such a complex game was pulled together despite facing significant adversities along the way would end up being quite remarkable. Not only was the initial planning done by someone who had never worked on a video game before, it was also done with limited guidance, because Sakaguchi and other senior figures such as Shibuya and Nasir were unavailable due to their commitment to working on Highway Star. Because of this, the reality was that full production happened within a period of just 3 months. And even during that time, when new staff members joined the production team, they would need to get up to speed with the project before they would be able to make an active contribution. That such a polished and innovative game was created against this backdrop showed the sheer tenacity, passion and commitment that existed within the team. And the role that Sakaguchi played towards instilling these values should not be understated. After all, he had been willing to put his entire career and reputation on the line because of just how much he believed in the project. Final Fantasy would end up going to market in Japan on the 18th of December 1987. And not only did Square follow through with making 400,000 copies available during the launch period, they also showed confidence by installing a hefty price tag of 5,900 yen. This would not only make Final Fantasy by far the most expensive price point for a game ever produced by Square in the Famicom era, it was also a significant increase on other leading games, such as Dragon Quest II, which had retailed for 5,500 yen, and the Famicom port of The Legend of Zelda, which had retailed for only 4,900 yen. Critics came out in support of these decisions as they praised the game. Famicom Tsushin awarded Final Fantasy 34 out of 40, granting it a place in their coveted Gold Hall of Fame. To justify this, across the 4 Famitsu reviewers, there was complimentary feedback granted for the game's storytelling and general game design. They also singled out the innovative battle scenes and high-quality graphics. Famitsu also commended Square for even having the audacity to try and challenge Dragon Quest in the manner that they had, especially as it did not come across as a simple clone and even enhanced numerous aspects. Family Computer Magazine, another Japanese publication, surveyed their readers. Across the various elements, this led to Final Fantasy being awarded the respectable score of 59.53 out of 30. Their readers felt the strongest aspects of the game were the characters, the music, and how engaging the design was throughout. However, even though it scored well, they felt the weakest aspect was its originality. These positive elements, when combined with a solid marketing campaign, helped to create a high degree of intrigue in and around the game's launch, and as a result, Final Fantasy managed to sell through its entire initial shipment. That Final Fantasy performed so well was pretty significant for both Square and Sakaguchi, as it vindicated the decisions that had been made by both parties. But it wasn't so much the volume of copies sold that warranted celebration. What was more important was how much money those copies had generated. The reality was that Square didn't struggle to sell games. Instead, they struggled to sell games at a compelling price point. In 1987 alone, Square had managed to release multiple games that would go on to sell more than 400,000 copies, with the likes of Crystal Dragon and even Operation Jumpout achieving this milestone. But where they had continued to struggle was the price point, and the performance of Final Fantasy showed that they had finally found a meaningful property that could justify being sold at a premium. It meant that even though the release of Final Fantasy was not a massive success within the wider context of the Japanese video games industry, for Square it was monumental. After the production had stopped of new copies of Final Fantasy, over 520,000 copies had been sold in Japan. This generated almost 2 billion yen in net revenue, a figure that was over double their previous best performing title. It changed everything, and Square would be quick to adapt. Sakaguchi would also make the decision to stay at the company, and due to the vital role that was played in the creation of Final Fantasy, he would be tasked with spearheading the next phase in the evolution of Square. Over the next few years, Square would pivot from being a company that attempted to shovel out as many games as possible to being one that focused on quality over quantity. And at the forefront of this new approach would be Final Fantasy. But even though Square now had a clear vision for how they could build out the Japanese side of their business, and this vision paid dividends over the next few years, the major question that remained was how well they could transition this vision over to taking advantage of the resurgent North American video game market. By the time Final Fantasy had released in Japan, Square had already released a handful of games in North America, but to do so, they had relied on third-party publishers. It would see Operation Jumpout published by Acclaim as the 3D Battles of World Runner, and Highway Star would be published by Nintendo as Rad Racer. The 3D Battles of World Runner would see modest returns, but Rad Racer turned out to be a huge hit in foreign markets. Selling well over 1 million copies, it became a fan favourite, and whenever Nintendo wanted to showcase the power and performance of their system, they often used Rad Racer. Both of these games had been overseen by Sakaguchi, and it meant the next logical subject for localization should have been Final Fantasy, but the sheer scale of the game would end up being a significant stumbling block. Unlike more arcade-centric titles, role-playing games featured huge amounts of dialogue, and this would need to be understood and translated in such a manner that everything would make sense as an extended narrative, as opposed to just the context of a particular menu or a specific scene. With Square choosing to move away from those arcade-centric titles, the knock-on effect was that expansion into North America was put on hold in favour of consolidating their place within the Japanese market. They would create Squaresoft Incorporated as a wholly owned North American subsidiary in 1989, but the focus of this subsidiary was on the profitable localization of smaller projects such as King's Knight, as opposed to bigger, more complex titles such as Final Fantasy. This was something Square found out the hard way, as their own efforts to localize Final Fantasy would fall flat. As a result, Square would end up partnering with Nintendo. Masters of their craft, Nintendo had become adept at acting as a gateway into the North American market for Japanese publishers. Square themselves had benefited from this, as Rad Racer enjoyed more success overseas than it ever did in Japan, but role-playing games were a different quantity. As had been the case in Japan before the release of Dragon Quest, in North America, role-playing games were sophisticated products that were enjoyed by gamers playing on personal computers, not those who owned home consoles. It would be Dragon Quest again that they hoped would be the catalyst. Retitled as Dragon Warrior to avoid infringing with an existing pen and paper role-playing game owned by Simulation Productions, Dragon Quest would launch in North America 3 years after its initial Japanese release. But in an almost identical mirror to what had happened 3 years prior in Japan, Dragon Warrior did not resonate with owners of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it led to sales being very poor. They were so poor that Nintendo would end up giving copies of the game away for free to subscribers of Nintendo Power magazine, but this initiative did lead to over 500,000 copies ending up in the hands of consumers. The poor performance of Dragon Warrior could have been seen as a bad omen for the localization of other role-playing games, but Nintendo were pleased enough to commit to supporting Square on the localization of Final Fantasy. When Final Fantasy was released in the middle of 1989, North American audiences were much more receptive. Dragon Quest had again paved the way, but unlike in Japan, where it had gained what seemed like an insurmountable domination over the market due to being an unrivaled trailblazer for so long, this was not the case in North America. Clayton Woolnam of Video Games and Computer Entertainment noted that Final Fantasy was role-playing adventure at its best, complementing the job system and extolling that the game design would allow for an exhaustive amount of combinations and challenges to be overcome. Roe Adams III, when writing for Computer Gaming World, was also excited to tell North American audiences about Final Fantasy. For PC gamers, he compared it to the likes of Ultima 3 and Wizardry, and provided a thorough breakdown of how the various gameplay mechanics worked, even going so far as to suggest the optimum party of 2 fighters, a white mage and a black mage. This positive press, when combined with a more tailored marketing campaign that applied learnings from the unsuccessful launch of Dragon Warrior, allowed Final Fantasy to find a foothold in North America, and that foothold would end up leading to over 700,000 copies being sold. It was an incredible number, not least because it exceeded the number of copies Final Fantasy had sold in Japan. But beyond that, the even more significant metric was that Final Fantasy had sold around 40% more copies than Dragon Warrior had managed in the same region. And the importance of this would only be further emphasized when considering that Dragon Warrior only managed to find its way into so many homes because copies were literally given away. All things considered, Nintendo and indeed Square could not have hoped for a better North American launch, and by the end of 1989, Final Fantasy had been established as the preeminent role-playing series on the Nintendo Entertainment System. As the life cycle of both the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System drew to a close, Final Fantasy proved to be a huge hit. Its combined sales across Japan and North America were approximately 1.22 million, positioning it as one of the best-selling games to have been released for the system. And it was awarded numerous accolades, such as coming 9th within Famitsu's Game of the Year awards and 2nd within their RPG category, only losing out to Dragon Quest III. But beyond just sales of the game, Final Fantasy had created a lasting cultural impact in Japan through the production of supporting content. And this related to not just the creation of merchandise, but also physical events that will be used to celebrate the franchise, and even the production of alternative adventures that could be enjoyed by those who were not fortunate enough to own a home console. In the years that followed, Square explored numerous initiatives, and one of the first coincided with not just the 1-year anniversary of Final Fantasy, but also the release of its predecessor, Final Fantasy II. On the 17th of December 1988, this saw Square open an official Final Fantasy store in Tokyo's bustling Shibuya ward. Inside, fans would be able to purchase a wide range of merchandise. This would include some more traditional items, such as posters, pencil cases and t-shirts, through to some more unique items, such as video game soundtracks. Throughout the 1980s, hardware had advanced to the point that composers were able to produce music that had real substance. There were still significant limitations, but these advances saw music become as much a part of the experience as the graphics and the gameplay. Recognizing this shift, an innovative music publisher called Alpha Records decided to take action, but it wouldn't be the first time they would take such a bold risk. In 1978, they published the first album by Yellow Magic Orchestra, famed for its use of real video game sound effects to make music. Fast forward 6 years, and Alpha innovated again by releasing a vinyl album that was dedicated to video game music. It was simply called Video Game Music, and it contained a collection of now legendary pieces from the likes of Pac-Man, Xevious, and Galaga. Such was its success that the following year they published The Return of Video Game Music, and the year after that, The Best of Video Game Music. In 1986, Alpha would then partner with the likes of Konami, Hudson, Tecmo, and Capcom to produce publisher-specific albums. And Nintendo would also take notice, releasing the Super Mario Bros. Original soundtrack on cassette and vinyl. But what made this particular release quite special was that alongside the main overworld theme as it appeared in-game, the album included an orchestral version of the same theme. Square would also get in on the act, releasing soundtracks for Cruise Chaser Blasty and Alpha, and as 1987 progressed, other publishers would start to release albums that would accompany the release of their individual properties. But even though Final Fantasy featured more music than any other game produced by Square to date, the decision was taken to hold off releasing any kind of album related to Final Fantasy, with Square opting to instead wait until Final Fantasy II had been released. By this point, video game music had become much more popular, and it was not uncommon for there to be well over 10 video game music releases happening every month. And to highlight just how popular video game music had become, there were 7 other albums released on the exact same day that Square and Polystar released their Final Fantasy 1 and 2 combined soundtrack. What was known as All Sounds of Final Fantasy 1 and 2 was released on the 21st of December 1988, and it was made available for people to purchase on CD and cassette. For almost everyone involved, this would be a landmark album. Not only would it allow players to hear music from the original Final Fantasy in its original 8-bit format without having to play the game, but anyone who purchased the album would also be treated to some unused pieces of music that did not make the final cut. Beyond that, All Sounds of Final Fantasy 1 and 2 would feature a special track. It was called Farewell FF World, and unlike every other track on the album, it was not worked on by Nobuo Uematsu. Instead, it was arranged by a musician called Michiaki Kato, and it would feature modern instrumentation. But the most appealing part of the track was that it would serve as a huge medley, combining pieces from Final Fantasy 1 and 2 into a long, blended experience that was perfect for those who had fallen in love with Uematsu's work over the 2 games. At launch, All Sounds of Final Fantasy 1 and 2 retailed for 2,348 yen, or just under $20 at the time. And after selling over 12,500 copies, it would end up reaching number 67 on the Oricon charts, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue for Square. The success of the album showed Square that there was real appetite within the fanbase for products that would enrich, enhance, and extend enjoyment beyond just the games themselves, and that these additional products could be used to generate huge sums of supplemental revenue. Buoyed by the commercial success of All Sounds of Final Fantasy 1 and 2, Uematsu himself started to explore what's possible within the realms of audio, beyond just the production of albums that contained tracks from the games. And one of his main sources of inspiration would be Dragon Quest. Unlike many other video game scores, which were composed by relatively novice composers, the Dragon Quest soundtrack had been composed by a famed Japanese film and television composer called Koichi Sugiyama. Sugiyama had been intrigued by video games and had even written to Enix as a fan. This then opened up discussions about a collaboration, and after working on the soundtrack for a game called Wingman 2, Sugiyama composed the score for Dragon Quest. To say this score was groundbreaking would be an understatement, as beyond just the level of quality, the way that Sugiyama created distinct melodies around 8 central pillars would provide a template for other up-and-coming composers. Those themes would then serve as the backbone for a revolutionary occurrence, as Sugiyama used his experience to collaborate with the Tokyo Strings Ensemble to create one of the first recordings of video game music using a live orchestra. These recordings would be released on the 5th of October 1986 as the Dragon Quest Suite. And the following year, on the 20th of August, that same music would be performed live to sell out crowds at purpose-led video game-related classical concerts. That the music of Dragon Quest had elicited such a strong response amongst consumers was nothing short of mind-blowing for a composer such as Uematsu. But after seeing how well received the music of Final Fantasy had been, he started wondering if it would be possible for his music to receive the same treatment. After numerous investigations, Uematsu decided to reach out to renowned classical composer Katsuhisa Hitori. Hitori had worked on numerous film scores and anime soundtracks, and Uematsu felt he would be more than capable of helping to transition his compositions to a grander scale. In the initial sense, Hitori was not interested, but after Uematsu, by his own admission, begged him to work on the project, Hitori would end up relenting, and he worked with his son Takayuki Hitori on figuring out how they could transition Uematsu's 8-bit score into what would become known as the Symphonic Suite Final Fantasy. Everything would come to fruition on the 20th of May 1989, as the Tokyo Symphony Orchestra performed 7 pieces of music that had been arranged by Katsuhisa and Takayuki Hitori. They would span across Final Fantasy 1 and 2, with 3 pieces being based on tracks from the original game and 4 relating to tracks from the second game. Many fans were present to enjoy the elaborate renditions of these pieces, but perhaps the person who was most affected was Uematsu himself. As he had created the original compositions, he compared attending the concert to attending his daughter's wedding, where he would play the role of a poor father who was going to marry his daughter away to a rich guy. For those who were unable to attend or wanted to reminisce and listen again, Symphonic Suite Final Fantasy would then be released as a standalone album a few months later on the 25th of July. Alongside using music to increase the enjoyment of Final Fantasy, Square also wanted to support people who enjoyed role-playing but didn't own a Famicom or weren't interested in video games. And they did this through the production of gamebooks. The first book of this ilk released alongside Final Fantasy in December of 1987, and it would see Square partner with an established publisher who were well versed with producing this kind of content. Published as the 39th entry in Kaibunsha's very popular Adventure Hero range, Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystal Succession would be a 235-page adventure gamebook that could be played using pen and paper. It would also allow players to embark on a role-playing adventure that wasn't predetermined, much like the video game, but it wouldn't just be a simple retelling. Instead, Legend of the Crystal Succession would act as a distant prequel, focusing on the story of a boy and girl who were in search of the Water Crystal. 4 months later, a second book was published called Final Fantasy Heroes of the Light. But instead of being released by Kaibunsha, it was published by a rival company called Futabasha. Heroes of the Light became part of Futabasha's own ever-expanding adventure gamebook series, featuring as part of their 1988 lineup that included books about Ys, Space Harrier, and wizardry. Its format was very similar to Legend of the Crystal Succession, but the premise of the narrative would act as an alternative retelling. This would see the Heroes of Light focus on 4 new Warriors of Light who were called Toy, Rom, Marek, and Gia. They had each been blessed by a priestess adopting classic jobs like warrior, thief, and red mage so that they could fight back against the evil forces of chaos. This book would again share its core mythology with the Final Fantasy video game, but everything else would be independent, even the world map. Alongside these 2 books, Square also started to produce supporting literary works that were much grander in scope, and one of the most intriguing was the Final Fantasy Monster Manual. Featuring a name that was a clear reference back to Dungeons & Dragons, the Monster Manual would take a much closer look at the awe-inspiring artwork that Yoshitaka Amano had created in support of the game. And alongside general concept art based around the protagonists and the wider lore, this would see a significant amount of focus placed on their enemies. For many years after, Square used supplemental content such as merchandise, books, and even original video animation to expand the Final Fantasy brand, as they wanted to focus on producing fresh and innovative games as opposed to revisiting older properties. There would be the occasional port to make sure older games could be enjoyed by those who had purchased newer platforms, but seldom would these ports make any significant changes to the core experience. But that all changed at the turn of the millennium. Square was facing considerable financial pressure due to how many resources had been committed to producing Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. It saw them explore new avenues for revenue, and with the handheld scene continuing to prosper, there was a growing desire amongst consumers to experience home console games on the go. The only challenge was that Square could not produce games for the Game Boy Advance, having burnt that bridge when they decided to develop Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation. As a result, Square decided to align with Bandai. Bandai had been producing home consoles for quite some time, but they had struggled to make the same kind of impact as Nintendo or Sega. To address this, they partnered with Koto, a company founded by the legendary Nintendo inventor Gunpei Yokoi. Their hope was that Koto would help them to come up with a viable competitor to the Game Boy, and what they came up with became known as the Wonder Swan. The Wonder Swan did well enough upon launch, but there were clear deficiencies. This saw Bandai work on a quick follow-up, the Wonder Swan Color, and to ensure it hit the ground running, they partnered with a suite of publishers to create a strong launch lineup. One of those publishers was Square, who committed to producing a new rendition of the original Final Fantasy. This new version of Final Fantasy will be remade from the ground up so as to appeal to both old fans and new fans alike. And to make sure the game delivered on those objectives, even though development was conducted by an entirely new team, they were overseen by Akitoshi Kawazu, Koichi Ishii, and Nobuo Uematsu, with Hironobu Sakaguchi serving as one of the executive producers. By doing this, even though the visuals, game design, and music would be modernized, any changes that were made will be in keeping with the original vision. The WonderSwan Color remake of Final Fantasy would end up featuring brand new 16-bit graphics with an expanded color palette, and new sprites were drawn for not just the jobs, but also the various NPCs. New cutscenes were also created that helped to flesh out the story in a way that was not possible on the Famicom due to limited space, and the soundtrack was rearranged, with Uematsu even composing some brand new tracks. These changes helped to make this version of Final Fantasy much more in line with how Final Fantasy had been represented during the 16-bit era. When it launched on the 9th of December in the year 2000, consumers loved it. It would see 50% of those who purchased a WonderSwan Color during its launch month also pick up a copy of Final Fantasy. And due to its quality, this version of the game would become a reference point for almost every future re-release of the original game. Those re-releases would come thick and fast. An enhanced version of the WonderSwan Color remake was released on the PlayStation less than 2 years after, which even included FMVs. But the next major enhancement would come as part of the Dawn of Souls compilation. Having managed to strike a deal with Nintendo, Square were once again allowed to produce video games for their consoles. And after fulfilling their obligation to produce original properties first, such as Crystal Chronicles and Tactics Advance, Square got straight to work on pumping out ports of their older games. The first of these would be Final Fantasy I and II Advance, which was renamed to Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls for its Western release. Production would be overseen by Takashi Tokita, who had worked on the original game, and Kosuke Miyamoto, who had worked on the PlayStation port. They would work with a small contingent of employees from Square to provide direction to Toze, their outsourcing partner. There would again be numerous tweaks made to audio and visual presentation, as well as gameplay, but perhaps the most noticeable part of the Dawn of Souls version would be the Soul of Chaos. This will be offered as the collective name for a group of 4 bonus dungeons that could be found throughout the map, each related to one of the 4 elements, and they would become available to the player once the relevant Chaos Fiend had been defeated. Designed to test players, these dungeons will be much longer than the traditional set, and would feature a new suite of enemies pulled in from the wider franchise, such as Shinryu, Omega, and Gilgamesh. Upon release, Final Fantasy I and II Advance would end up selling 140,000 copies in its first week on sale in Japan, with almost 300,000 copies sold across its lifetime in that region. For a few years, Dawn of Souls will be considered the definitive version of the original Final Fantasy, but for the 20th anniversary, Square Enix decided to pull out all the stops. By this point in time, the PlayStation Portable had delivered significant returns around the world, and Square Enix wanted to take advantage of its power. This meant heavy emphasis would be placed on visuals, and it would see Tetsuya Nomura and Koichi Ishii assigned to supervise a team of artists who were responsible for delivering a significant overhaul of the game's graphics. Yoshitaka Amano would even be commissioned to produce a brand new logo. These elements helped to make the 20th anniversary edition of Final Fantasy feel fresh, and they were complemented by another new dungeon that was called the Labyrinth of Time. This was introduced as a stern test for players who had already beaten and mastered the Soul of Chaos. It would feature 4 distinct floors, each of which contained a puzzle that needed to be solved within a specific period of time. At its conclusion, players would then face off against Chronodia, a devilish superboss that would have its strength determined by how many blue and red seals the player had obtained throughout the course of the dungeon. Sales would not end up being as strong as Dawn of Souls, with only 140,000 copies shipped throughout its lifetime in Japan, but it would end up as a PlayStation Essential, denoting that over 400,000 copies have been sold worldwide. Following the release of the 20th Anniversary Edition, Square Enix would continue to port this version to other platforms, including mobile devices and the Nintendo eShop, where stereoscopic 3D graphics were added. Due to how well the 20th Anniversary Edition performed, it wouldn't be another 14 years until the game would see a meaningful re-release, and this was produced for a very specific reason. Over the years, Square Enix had treated each of the 8-bit and 16-bit Final Fantasy games as isolated entries. By taking this approach, even though the original games were quite consistent with how they looked and played across the Famicom and Super Famicom, on modern systems, huge disparities have been created. The Pixel Remastered series was meant to address this, taking each individual game back to its roots, but layering over consistent audio and visual presentation elements. To oversee this, Square Enix assigned Yoshinori Kitase, Kazuko Shibuya, and Noboru Uematsu, with Shibuya even going back to fulfill the same role she did on the original game by serving as lead pixel artist. There would still be numerous quality of life adjustments made to gameplay, but one of the most crucial elements was that this version of Final Fantasy would be a modern version of the original game, as opposed to being a port of either the Dawn of Souls or the 20th Anniversary Edition. And for that reason, quite a few of the new cutscenes would be removed alongside all of the bonus dungeons and bosses. Despite having the focus being around ease of access and consistency of experience, Square Enix chose to only release the Pixel remasters on Steam and mobile devices. It would take a further 2 years for them to be released on home consoles. Alongside the various re-releases of the original Final Fantasy, Square Enix decided to go against the original mantra of only having supplemental experiences produced in a non-video game format. It would see new video games produced that would serve as extensions of the story scene within Final Fantasy, meant to enrich and entertain those who wanted to see and learn more about that specific world. The first of these games would be Dissidia Final Fantasy. In its initial stages, Dissidia was intended to be a fighting game focused around Kingdom Hearts. However, after progressing through initial planning, the team felt it would not be in keeping to have Disney characters fighting against one another. It would make sense, however, for Final Fantasy characters. The premise would therefore be to create a game where prominent Final Fantasy protagonists and antagonists from across the franchise would come together and fight against each other. But to ensure this made sense from a narrative perspective, the team went all the way back to the original Final Fantasy. Kind of. When Dawn of Souls was released, it included a small reference to a brand new character called Cid of the Lufane. This retcon was made to ensure every mainline entry into the franchise adhered to the trope of there always being a character called Cid. And due to Cid of the Lufane not actually appearing in the game, as he was instead mentioned by an NPC, it provided a unique opportunity for expansion. When conceptualizing the story for Dissidia, the scenario team thought it would be interesting to take the story of Cid further, and this decision would lead to the creation of a brand new universe and a new iteration of Chaos. Dissidia would also introduce a wholly original version of the Warrior of Light. As the Warrior of Light was more of a broad concept within the original game as opposed to a specific defined character, this presented a small problem for the development team as to who the protagonist should be from the original game. To work around this, the development team decided to create a brand new character who will be based on Yoshitaka Amano's original concept art for the Knight class. The Warrior of Light, as created for Dissidia, would then appear in another property that would have an unorthodox connection to the original Final Fantasy. This property would be called Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, and it would serve as an alternative universe prequel where players would take on the role of Garland, the main antagonist from the original game. Beyond these two properties, others would also exist with a connection to Final Fantasy. Mobius, for example, would feature many of the same characters and plot concepts, albeit with a modern twist. It would see the Warrior of Light, affectionately named Wall, and a quest to defeat Chaos. But that would only be the start of that particular journey. Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light would also reuse many of the same concepts, and that so many games have been able to expand and elaborate on the story in such a manner is a testament to the work done by Sakaguchi, Terada, and the rest of the team all those years ago, in spite of the restrictions they faced. It goes without saying that Final Fantasy is and was a special game. Arriving in 1987 as a challenger to the established Dragon Quest franchise, its success would not only convince Sakaguchi to stay within the video games industry, it would change the fate of the entire company and the lives of the many people who worked there. Square would go on to become one of the biggest video game companies in the world, and Final Fantasy would end up becoming the preeminent role-playing franchise, and the likes of Sakaguchi, Uematsu, and Amano would go on to become household names in Japan, recognized for their incredible contributions. But none of that would have been possible without a bullish dream that epitomized what Final Fantasy would grow to become, a franchise that challenged the status quo through innovation, dedication, and commitment, and daring to do what others could not or would not. Between 1986 and 1987, Square had established themselves as an up-and-coming video game publisher and developer in Japan. Much of their success had come from developing games for personal computers, but after reinvesting a significant portion of their earnings back into the company, Square were confident that their successes could be replicated on the Famicom and its popular peripheral, the Famicom Disk System. What followed could not have been predicted. Pushing too far outside of their comfort zone, Square became trapped. They had aspirations to become one of the best video game developers in Japan, but by the end of 1987, they had become a shadow of their former selves, sucked into the rat race of producing shovelware for the Famicom Disk System in order to simply survive. The release of Final Fantasy would then change everything. Its commercial success provided Square with financial security. But beyond that, Final Fantasy had restored the company's reputation and convinced employees such as Hironobu Sakaguchi that they belonged within the video games industry. Freed from its shackles, Square pushed in a bold, new direction. This would set the stage for the release of a brand new video game that would be revolutionary, and it would be called Final Fantasy II. Soon after Final Fantasy had been released, it became clear to almost everyone at Square that its performance and impact within the industry was quite unlike any game they had released in the past. Reviews were very positive, praising Final Fantasy for its merits, and within weeks, huge chunks of the initial shipment of 400,000 units had already been purchased, generating vast sums of money for Square in a short period of time. Given the amount of capital they now had access to, it would have been easy for the management layer to become giddy with excitement. But the decision was taken to be pragmatic. They did not want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Even though 1987 had not been a very profitable year for Square, 1985 and 1986 had been. The release of games such as Will, The Death Trap 2, Cruise Chaser Blasty, and Alpha had provided a solid base. Feeling empowered and ambitious, the management team splurged on a fancy new office in Ginza, rewarded long-time employees with full-time contracts, and hired a raft of new part-time employees so that they could develop more games simultaneously. The plan had been to capitalise on the ever-growing home console market. But with no arcade library to leverage, and none of their innovative titles creating a strong enough user base, the growth and expansion that had been envisioned never materialised. That was until the release of Final Fantasy. The success of this game provided a legitimate platform from which Square could grow, and it became obvious to the leadership team that in order to take advantage of the opportunity that had presented itself, they would need to change. For over a year, Square had been driven by a relentless pursuit of short-term gains, as they felt there was just no other choice. They believed that by producing so many games, it would sustain the business and increase their chances of creating a smash hit. As such, they produced 10 games during this period, publishing even more. And with only a limited number of employees available, the turnaround time kept getting shorter and shorter, and the quality kept on diminishing. Final Fantasy then became that smash hit they were searching for. But the reality was that the objective had been achieved in spite of the approach they had taken, not because of it. Many of the games they produced during this period were not done so because the creator had a spark of inspiration. They were instead created because the management layer had imposed its will and steered the creator to make something they thought would sell. Final Fantasy was the opposite. It was driven by Hironobu Sakaguchi from inception through to completion. The passion was there when the initial vision was delivered to the entire company, and that passion then manifested through everyone who became involved with the project. They believed in Sakaguchi's vision and were willing to put themselves through hell to ensure it did not just deliver on expectations, but exceed them. This made Square realize that the previous approach was not sustainable. Staff were burning out and becoming disillusioned. And so, from that point forward, the decision was taken to move away from their relentless pursuit of short-term gains. They would instead focus on a more long-term strategy that favoured quality over quantity. To facilitate this new strategy, almost the entire development arm of Square was restructured. Prior to the shift, there were, at times, up to 4 separate development teams. These teams would each have a designated leader, and there would be a handful of individuals who were assigned to support as dedicated resources. Everyone else was then fluid, serving as a floating resource that could jump in and help out with whatever was required at that specific moment. This approach had worked when Square was pumping out as many games as possible, but when thinking more long-term and having that focus on quality over quantity, it was determined that for Square to be more productive and deliver more positive results, they would need to have more consistency. This mantra was related to consistency of product, consistency of vision, and consistency of staff, and it drove the decision to restructure. The new setup would see there be just 2 main development teams, one led by Sakaguchi and the other led by Kazuhiko Aoki. And the 2 other teams, one of which was helmed by Hiromichi Tanaka, would be dissolved and then absorbed. These 2 new teams would each have a clear objective. Aoki would work with a smaller group of individuals that included the likes of Takashi Tokita and Masanori Hoshino. Their task would be to focus on designing something innovative and fun, on a much smaller budget. This would end up manifesting as Hanjaku Hero, and Bits Laboratory, a development studio who had also contributed to King's Knight and the Famicom port of Thexter, would be contracted to help Aoki's team deliver on their vision. Sakaguchi would then be responsible for leading a team that included the likes of Hiromichi Tanaka, Kazuko Shibuya, Nasir Jabeli, Koichi Ishii, and Akitoshi Kawazu. They would be given much more budget, and provided the task of building upon what was accomplished with Final Fantasy, leveraging the brand to create a sequel that would surpass the original in every conceivable way. There were just 2 problems though. 1, they had never planned to create a sequel, and 2, not long after the release of Final Fantasy, Enix released Dragon Quest III. Even though Square had developed a plethora of games prior to the release of Final Fantasy, they had seldom developed any continuations. In fact, only 2 of their games could be categorized in this way. The first was Will, the Death Trap 2. Released in mid-1985, Will was a follow-up to Square's first ever game, The Death Trap. When compared to its predecessor, Will would end up being a relative smash hit. Whereas the original sold only 3,000 copies, the sequel sold over 100,000, generating 19 times more revenue. Such was its success that the revenue generated by Will was used to lay down the foundations for Square to exist as a sustainable company. The second game was JJ, Tobidase Daisekusen Part 2. This game was released on the 7th of December 1987, just before Square went to market with Final Fantasy. Developed by a skeleton crew, it was designed as a quick and easy follow-up to the original game that had been released earlier in the year. Nasir Jebeli would act as the chief architect, with limited input provided by Sakaguchi and Tokita. And instead of being developed for the Famicom Disk System, it was developed for the Famicom. However, even though the sequel would still make use of stereoscopic 3D, to gain the full effect, players would be required to purchase the all-new Famicom 3D system. Unlike Will the Death Trap 2, it's assumed that this sequel did not fare so well. Reviews were not as positive, and sales were so low that they were never disclosed within any of the traditional white papers. From a publishing perspective, Square had also overseen the Deep Dungeon franchise. Developed by Hummingbird Soft, the original Deep Dungeon was a first-person dungeon crawler that was heavily inspired by wizardry. Square's involvement was through the Disc Original Group, a publishing collective that contained 7 different companies. It was set up as a way of helping them to compete against bigger players on the Famicom Disk System. But whereas 6 of these companies would oversee development and management of their respective IP, Square would then take the lead for everything else, including the sales and marketing of all produced titles. Due to the success of the initial Deep Dungeon, Hummingbird Soft decided to work on a follow-up, and as it was published by the Disc Original Group, Square would again oversee everything relating to sales and marketing. This follow-up was built using an iterative approach to development. Instead of making wholesale changes to graphics and overarching game design, the development team instead chose to focus on making smaller tweaks that would remove pain points and increase enjoyment. Additional effort was then placed on improving the scale of the experience. Many of these changes would end up being positive, and Deep Dungeon was received in a more favourable sense by critics. But while the improved scale was appreciated, there was also a sense that everything else about the game was a bit too derivative and lacking innovation. Perhaps as a consequence, the commercial performance of Deep Dungeon 2 was lacking in comparison to the original. Within the wider marketplace, other publishers had also been experimenting with how to go about the production of sequels, and 2 of the more intriguing examples came from Dragon Quest and Zelda. By the time Final Fantasy had released, there were already 2 Dragon Quest games in the marketplace. There were distinct similarities between the 2 games, but a concerted effort had been placed on making them feel unique. And this was done by either improving aspects that just did not resonate with consumers, or by implementing elements they were unable to do so before, due to technical or knowledge-based limitations. Part of the reason they were able to do this in such an elegant manner was that there was always a long-term plan associated with Dragon Quest. Even though role-playing games had a market on personal computers in Japan, they were still niche, and amongst the console user base, they were almost unheard of. As a consequence, both Koichi Nakamura and Yuji Horii knew that even if Dragon Quest was heralded as the best role-playing game of all time, they would struggle to establish it as a must-have title due to how underdeveloped the overarching genre was. From the beginning, they therefore planned to produce multiple Dragon Quest games, so that both the franchise and the role-playing genre would start to gain recognition. It was for this reason that development on Dragon Quest II started before Dragon Quest had even shipped. And it meant that instead of overseeing wholesale changes, Nakamura and Horii sought to evolve and refine what they had already created. Perhaps one of the best examples of this related to the party setup. In the original Dragon Quest, emphasis was placed on there being only one playable character. This had a significant influence on gameplay as it forced the battle scene to focus on one-on-one combat. But this was not the original vision. Instead, Nakamura was required to compromise. Having been influenced in a big way by Wizardry, Ultima, and Questron, Nakamura sought to implement whatever he could. And with respect to party building, Wizardry had a complicated system that saw numerous characters band together to create a party. Nakamura had wanted to create something similar for Dragon Quest, but as he was unable to, the decision was taken to use the original game as a stepping stone towards a much grander vision. Dragon Quest II would be much closer to that vision, as a party of 3 was created. This would consist of 3 predetermined characters, the hero, the prince, and the princess, and they would each have their own individual stat growth, equipment, and spells. Further to this, by having 3 party members, the battle scene was also made much more complex. It saw multiple monsters added as enemy combatants, and by introducing basic buffs and debuffs, Dragon Quest II became a much more strategic game. The narrative, overseen by Horii, was also spruced up. Perhaps anticipating that people playing Dragon Quest II might not have experienced the original game, the decision was taken for there to only be a loose narrative connection between the two games. But there was a connection. It would see Dragon Quest II set 100 years after the events of the original game, and the protagonist would be a descendant of the original protagonist. Dragon Quest III would then continue in a similar manner. Arriving on the 10th of February 1988, Dragon Quest III would serve as a culmination of everything the first two games were attempting to achieve. This was accomplished by the developers continuing to iterate on mechanics that worked, removing mechanics that just didn't resonate, and by introducing new mechanics that would serve to enhance the overall experience. Relating this back to the party setup, it would see Dragon Quest III feature a dynamic system that was far more advanced than Dragon Quest II. The initial member of the party would be the quintessential hero, and they could either be male or female. But additional party members could be recruited at the tavern, and they could be swapped in and out of the active party. To build upon this, a customizable class system was introduced that featured 8 distinct roles. It would also be possible to respec characters, allowing for a greater degree of freedom. Dragon Quest III would also retain a narrative connection with the original game, this time serving as a prequel. It would see the introduction of a named protagonist called Erdrick, who would be a distant relative of the hero from the original game. Dragon Quest III would also feature an evolved form of narrative that saw focus shifted on an episodic structure, with each passage of the game having equal importance. Upon its release, Dragon Quest III validated this consistent and evolving approach. It sold more than 1 million copies on its first day on sale, and almost 300 students were arrested for truancy, having skipped school to play the game. By the end of its first week on sale, 3 million copies had been sold, seeing the game gross 20 million yen, or the equivalent of around $154 million at the time. This was nothing short of sensational in the context of the home video game market, and it showed that role-playing games were no longer on the periphery. Later that same year, another huge game for the Famicom, The Legend of Zelda, would see its own sequel produced. The original game had sold 1.6 million copies on the Famicom Disk System, making it one of the best-selling games for Nintendo's ailing peripheral. As an action-adventure title, The Legend of Zelda stood apart from games that served to influence its development, games such as The Tower of Duraga. Critics lauded the game's graphics, music, and subtle narrative, but the majority of praise was for its compelling gameplay and how it connected with the need to explore. Shigeru Miyamoto would later reveal that this aspect in particular led to a lot of nerves ahead of the game's launch. Even though they were quite sure that Zelda was fun to play, there was also an appreciation that this was the first game they had developed where players would have time to ruminate about what they should do next. This was a far cry from games such as Donkey Kong, Excitebike, and Super Mario Bros., and the worst fear was that players would just get bored, or even worse, stressed out by having so much freedom. After The Legend of Zelda launched and became a critical and commercial success, these fears were dispelled in an instant. To capitalize, Nintendo were quick to start work on a follow-up, and it would again be developed for the Famicom Disk System. But even though a solid framework had been created, Miyamoto made an unorthodox decision. Instead of iterating, he chose to almost treat Zelda 2 as an original game. Some core elements would be retained, and the narrative would serve as a continuation, with Link returning as the protagonist a few years after the conclusion of the original game. Lore-based elements such as the magical sword also returned, but the wider narrative was evolved and gameplay saw fundamental shifts. The follow-up would still be overseen by Miyamoto and his close collaborator Takashi Tezuka, but no other staff members would return. In fact, development was conducted by a different team entirely, as Miyamoto wanted the two games to be fundamentally different. On the surface, this seemed like an extreme choice, but Miyamoto felt it was necessary to maximize the potential of an IP. An almost identical approach was taken with Mario Bros., as Super Mario Bros. Was developed by a different team, and had fundamental differences with game design. Donkey Kong would also go through a similar growth. In the case of Zelda 2, this would see the game transition from being a top-down action-adventure game to a side-scrolling adventure game that featured a robust and complex combat system. Role-playing elements would also be overlaid, with Link having numerous attributes that could be upgraded when leveling up. Upon launch, Nintendo were praised for their bold choices. Famitsu scored Zelda 2 as the second best game of 1987, with only Dragon Quest II receiving a higher score from the publication. And there was a sense that the game delivered an action role-playing experience unlike anything that had ever been seen before. Sales were also strong, and even though Miyamoto felt post-launch that they had made a huge mistake, as he felt it served as one of the few instances where they had rolled the game design dice and ended up with something that felt inferior to the original game, at the time, fans were not deterred by the change in approach. This, along with the iteration philosophies implemented by the development team working on Dragon Quest, showed that sequels did not have to be orthodox. They could deviate in quite significant ways and still deliver a compelling experience for fans who would enjoy the previous installment, and that principle would have a profound impact on the development of Final Fantasy II. As development on the original Final Fantasy proceeded, everyone working on the game became more and more convinced it would succeed. That conviction was personified by Sakaguchi, who had heated discussions with his superiors around how many copies of the game should be shipped. That Final Fantasy would sell upwards of 500,000 copies was a testament to the dedication and passion displayed by the team. They had poured all of their creative energy into the game, but with so much focus placed around ensuring the game would succeed, very little thought was placed around what they would do if it then actually did succeed. The business was, of course, restructured to take advantage of the opportunity that had been afforded to them by the unprecedented success of Final Fantasy, and Sakaguchi knew that the expectation would be there for them to deliver a bigger and better game that featured the Final Fantasy name. But as there had never been any thought about the what happens next scenario, and other properties had been released in the market by rival developers that were already bigger and better, the team who delivered Final Fantasy were in uncharted territory. With the decision made that Final Fantasy II would be the next project overseen by Sakaguchi and his team, initial planning discussions took place. But things were different this time around. Being brought back to work on a follow-up was not something that had been foreseen, and even though Sakaguchi was installed as the director, he was, by this point, creatively spent. Tanaka, his partner in crime, felt much the same. Neither had any grand vision for the project, and they were both suffering from mental and physical exhaustion. Their initial plan was therefore to make something quick and easy. This would have seen Final Fantasy II serve as a straight sequel, with numerous game design elements inherited from the original game, and a narrative where the Warriors of Light would return to defeat a new threat that had emerged. This would have been a very safe option, and it would have been in keeping with what other franchises had done, such as Deep Dungeon, to try and maintain a similar volume of sales from one iteration to the next. But the franchises that wanted to grow so as to become something more than the original were ambitious and adopted bolder approaches. Other similar or adjacent properties, such as Dragon Quest and Zelda, have been able to expand their franchises by taking significant design risks while keeping a degree of narrative consistency. This allowed these iterative properties to connect, facilitating the creation of ever-expanding fantasy worlds that could draw players in and keep them hooked. It was the ideal approach, and it was tried and tested with other mediums too. But these properties had the benefit of being developed with the knowledge that expansion had a high probability of happening. The production of successive titles had been planned for from the beginning. That's where Final Fantasy differed. The production of a sequel or any kind of related property had never even been entertained. The game had been developed as a Hail Mary, and the team put all their energy into its development, holding nothing back. And this had been done for one simple reason: they did not believe there would be a sequel. It meant there was no grand plan beyond its release to replicate the continued success of games such as Dragon Quest. And unsure as to the best way to proceed, Sakaguchi opened up the floor to the team. If they wanted Final Fantasy to make a real splash and grow to be a true competitor to Dragon Quest, he accepted that playing it safe was not the right approach. After all, Square had tried this countless times before, and they had only succeeded with Final Fantasy by doing the exact opposite of what was expected. However, as they had no fresh ideas themselves for how this could be accomplished with Final Fantasy II, there was a hope that maybe someone in the wider team had some ideas they were passionate about and wanted to share. As it turns out, someone did, and that someone was Akitoshi Kawazu. Kawazu was born on the 5th of November 1962, about 50 kilometers north of Mount Aso. He grew up in the small rural town of Ogoni, but despite being surrounded by nature, Kawazu was not the most athletic of children. Much of his time was instead spent dreaming. And in those dreams, Kawazu would create an alternate reality where he would be projected as the dynamic hero of any given scenario. At school, this played out in the form of creating games, of which Kawazu would be the architect. He would use the backs of supermarket flyers to jot down ever-expanding rule sets. And after being exposed to science fiction, these bespoke games started to become more and more grand in scale and more complex in their execution. Star Wars and Star Trek would be two properties with which a particular fascination was developed, and it will be through the latter franchise that Kawazu was introduced to video games. Having been accepted into the science school at the illustrious Tokyo Institute of Technology, Kawazu was given access to the latest computers, including the Apple II. And it just so happened that a new Star Trek game was being produced for that system. This acted as a gateway. Kawazu would spend afternoons playing games on the Apple II, but his friendship circles were also obsessed with importing board games from North America. They would spend hours attempting to understand the English rulebooks, but as they weren't fluent, much of their time was spent focusing on how they could have fun with the frameworks they at least did understand. This then afforded Kawazu an appreciation for the underlying rules that governed board games, as he felt they were more important than the finer details. Having spent so much time studying board games and video games, Kawazu dreamt of one day being able to create similar experiences of his own, but such jobs were in short supply, and his parents did not deem creating video games as a sensible career choice. With graduation looming, Kawazu instead managed to secure a junior position at Sony, but due to some unfortunate personal circumstances, he was unable to accept the position. The backup plan was to try and land some part-time work, and one of those jobs was a junior writing position at a magazine called Beep, where he wrote reviews about the latest video game releases. It was a fun job, but far from secure, so while working at Beep, Kawazu continued to look for alternative sources of employment and managed to secure a position at a software company. This was a good confidence booster, but right before starting, Kawazu backed out. He wasn't quite ready to give up on his dream of creating video games, and he knew that if he accepted the job, he would never again have the impetus to chase that dream. It just so happened that Square were looking to hire at that time, and having been familiar with the company after being exposed to their games while working at Beep, he decided to apply. After joining Square, Kawazu supported however he could, before being assigned to Sakaguchi's team to work on Highway Star and then Final Fantasy. Due to his experience with board games, Kawazu was an invaluable asset to the team. Even though numerous design concepts had already been established by the time he began working in earnest on Final Fantasy, Kawazu was able to create systems for battling and progression and worked with the programmers to bring these concepts to life. Due to the limited time assigned to development, these systems were quite standard and would be familiar for those who enjoyed role-playing games, either in tabletop form or via earlier video games such as Ultima or Wizardry. But as there would now be more time and budget assigned, Final Fantasy II would not be bound by the same constraints. When Sakaguchi opened up the floor for suggestions, Kawazu felt it was his chance to play the hero once again. The design concepts proposed by Kawazu for Final Fantasy II related to almost every facet of design. It meant there would be significant changes proposed to the narrative, the world and its supporting lore, and to the gameplay and wider progression of characters. This represented a significant risk. Final Fantasy had resonated with audiences, and based on how typical follow-up properties were handled, that audience would come into Final Fantasy II with expectations. If too much was changed, there was therefore a risk that audiences would be turned off and alienated. For this reason, the core team felt it would be wise to come up with a list of underlying principles that they felt Final Fantasy II would need to contain in order for it to still be considered a Final Fantasy game and a follow-up that would, on some level at least, make sense to consumers. Final Fantasy II would therefore retain the same core battle system with minor enhancements made to ensure it evolved in an appropriate manner. And a similar decision was taken around naming conventions of spells and equipment. These two were kept consistent to ensure the game felt familiar to existing players. With the framework then established, other aspects of the game were opened up to innovation. and the first major area of focus was the narrative. In the original Final Fantasy, the narrative revolved around 4 mysterious Warriors of Light who had been fated to save the world from its impending doom. These Warriors of Light were designed to be narrative vessels, a pretty common design choice at the time. As such, the player could name them whatever they wanted and assign them to any of the available jobs. They would, of course, make active contributions to move the narrative forward by speaking to NPCs and performing certain feats, but outside of this, there was no specific character development, and their contribution to the game's wider lore was largely passive. Final Fantasy II would scrap almost every single one of these narrative mechanics. From the outset, Kawazu had planned for the party of characters to have predetermined names. This represented a fundamental shift, as it would remove an element of customization from the player. But there was a belief that without taking this step, it would not be possible for the party members to have any kind of meaningful relationships with each other, nor the world around them. The original draft was written by Kawazu in the first few months of 1988, and although there would be similarities to the final script, there would also be stark differences in terms of its actual plot, its execution, and how it related to other design elements. This initial draft would focus on the kingdom of Altair and a conflict based around succession. Basil, the king of Altair, was growing old, and his 3 sons vied for the throne. Philip, the eldest son, was the natural successor by birth, and was also a knight of significant valour, but Basil preferred the crown to be passed to Roger, his 3rd son. As such, factions formed around the 2 sons, with powerful figures choosing which to back based on how their positions might improve within the kingdom following the passing of King Basil. Richard, the 2nd son, would want no part of this, and chose to leave the kingdom, but he would still find himself embroiled in the fight for succession. After leaving Altair, Richard joined the armed forces of the neighbouring kingdom of Elude. Their king, Heinrich, would seek to take advantage of the civil unrest brewing in Altair, and with Richard by his side, would have a claim on the throne. There would also be another faction involved, but they would have no specific interest in the kingdom of Altair or the crown. Decades prior to the events of the plot, the evil dragon Gawain had been defeated, and monsters were forced to live in the shadows and fight for scraps as a consequence. Gawain's daughter, Dole, now sought to unite the monsters and gain revenge on humanity. When compared to the original Final Fantasy, this proposed narrative was far more complex. There were rival factions and named characters, and they had clear motivations that were at odds with each other. Time was also taken to craft backstories and wider lore. Gawain, for example, was slain by a legendary hero called Firion, who sacrificed his own life to rid the land of evil. The supporting cast was also planned to include characters such as Minwu, a man who aspired to be the ultimate mage, Leon, a famous knight who hailed from the town of Bamberg, and Hilda, a female knight who stood in direct opposition to the monsters as they had abducted her mother when she was young. Paul, Gordon, and Layla also featured in similar guises, and there was a character called Rigel who was described as being a cold-hearted dark knight. These plot details would then be tied together by an intricate narrative that would have branching paths, with the paths dictated by which actions the player chose or indeed did not choose to take. For example, the player could have ended the game with Philip, Richard, and Roger all having been killed. This meant there would be no natural successor to the throne of Altair, and it would be open to a third party. The player could also choose whether to slay Dole and defeat the entirety of the monster faction. This choice would then work in conjunction with notions of fame and wealth to create multiple possible endings. Beyond that, during this early stage of development, there were also plans for Final Fantasy II to have a morality system, something that would have changed the way NPCs responded, and the system would have then been used to influence which characters joined the party. The passage of time would have also further complicated proceedings, as it could influence how and when certain events took place, or indeed, whether they took place at all. To say this was ambitious would be an understatement, especially since all of this was still planned to happen on the modest 8-bit infrastructure of the Famicom. But it was the exact kind of thinking that Sakaguchi needed. Kawazu was bursting with unique and innovative ideas, but they needed to be refined, and that was where he came in. Sakaguchi spent weeks modifying Kawazu's draft script. The idea was to take elements that worked while simplifying them as much as possible into something that was coherent and workable within the limitations of the Famicom. A revised first draft was produced on the 11th of March 1988. This new draft promoted Firion from being a mere lore entry into the role of main protagonist, and he will be joined by two new characters in Maria and Guy, and Leon, another character who had featured in the initial proposal, but would now take on an adjusted role. Altair would also retain its importance within the narrative, but King Basil and the two faction-leading sons would be removed. Richard, however, would survive the cull, transformed into a nomadic dragoon who was the last of his kind. Many other characters would undergo similar shifts. Hilda, for example, was now the leader of a rebellion, and Gordon was changed from being a cruel bounty hunter into one of the princes of Kashuan. An oppressive empire was also created to serve as a clear, overarching antagonist. This revision will be nowhere near as ambitious as Kawazu's original draft, but the overriding sentiment was retained. They knew that a more complex story was necessary, and this revised draft would still be much more complex and involved than the story created for the original Final Fantasy. To ensure it delivered on multiple levels, Sakaguchi also wanted to introduce some narrative concepts that were prevalent within Hollywood movies, such as the classic rug pull. From the very beginning, it was planned that Leon would be taken prisoner in the opening encounter. How this manifested would change as the script evolved, but Sakaguchi felt it was necessary to shock players immediately, forcing them to become invested within the first few minutes of the game. Over the coming weeks, Sakaguchi would continue to refine this script, working with Kawazu and Koichi Ishii to ensure it hit all the right beats. But as with the original game, the script would then be passed off to a freelance author called Kenji Terada. Terada was born on the 11th of July 1952 in Tokyo, and would end up attending a well-regarded high school where he explored illustration and literature. Many of his fellow classmates would end up going on to accomplish impressive feats, and one of them would become a founding member of Square. After graduating from high school, Terada attended the prestigious Waseda University. Here, he studied European history, and alongside his studies, time was spent pursuing illustration as a potential career upon graduation. During this time, Terada's illustrations were published in numerous high-profile newspapers and magazines, and due to the quality of his work, more and more opportunities continued to arrive. Due to the nature of these opportunities, Terada would often be pushed beyond illustrations, and he even became involved with animated productions. After graduating, Terada continued to explore this line of work, and would become involved with writing numerous screenplays for anime. And in 1980, Terada would join Osamu Tezuki, the creators of Astro Boy, as a chief assistant. Throughout this time, Terada would work on numerous animated shows, and two in particular, Space Cobra and Cat's Eye, had become popular amongst some of the staff at Square. Due to the connection Terada had with one of the founders, it was therefore suggested that they should collaborate, and so Sakaguchi, Hisashi Suzuki, one of the senior business development employees at Square, and some of the other prominent developers at the company decided to meet with Terada. Impressed by how the conversations went, Sakaguchi extended an offer to Terada, tasking him with helping them to make a game that would make people cry. At the time, Terada was working on a manga called Kinukiman. It was through this work that he had gained a reputation for writing such narratives, with the producer of Kinukiman even giving Terada the nickname Tearjerker Terada. After the initial meeting, Terada was unconvinced as to whether it would be possible to replicate his writing style within the medium of video games. However, after talking more and more with Sakaguchi, he chose to accept the offer and started working on the original Final Fantasy. That game would of course end up being a huge success, and with the story seen as one of the highlights, both Sakaguchi and Terada were keen to continue the working relationship. For Final Fantasy II, the brief would remain the same, but the initial scriptwriting process was quite different. Sakaguchi, Kawazu, and Ishii had each contributed to the wider outline, and Terada was responsible for taking the rough outline they had pulled together and turning it into a fully fleshed out narrative. The process was quite simple on paper, but in practice there were numerous hardships. Terada would find it difficult to handle the egos of some of the developers, as they had each become married to certain ideas and couldn't understand why they perhaps hadn't been given more spotlight within Terada's final treatment. On the other side, the developers would also need to try and figure out how they could incorporate some of Terada's original ideas into the game while maintaining balance. it led to certain elements being cut from the script, but as they were still such good ideas, Sakaguchi always held a belief that they will be able to use them for future projects. One thing that did become melded with Terada's script was an innovative dialogue system that would place more emphasis on NPCs. Unlike the original game, where NPCs would have set dialogue and they were far and few between, in Final Fantasy II, players would be able to talk to NPCs about specific keywords or phrases. Whenever new keywords were unlocked, players would need to go back and speak to NPCs as a way of learning more about the wider world. And the developers also believed that this would make the story progression feel more earned as opposed to it being spoon-fed. With the script taking shape, attention turned towards gameplay. To ensure a degree of consistency, the battle scene would remain quite familiar. This would see the same turn-based approach adopted, with the player able to input a certain set of commands and these commands then being resolved alongside the enemy actions. Improvements would still be made, but they would mostly be tweaks designed to enhance the combat experience. This would, for example, see the exploitable party positioning mechanic from the original game replaced by the concept of rows. New attack states would also be introduced, allowing the player to take advantage of preemptive strikes or deal with unfortunate ambushes. With the core battle system being so similar, much of the focus was instead placed on creating a brand new progression system. In the original game, many decisions were placed by the job system. This included progression, but it also permeated into other aspects, such as the sprite each character would use. As Final Fantasy II would use predetermined characters, the development team did not believe this approach would work. They instead wanted each character to have a fixed sprite so as to enhance the narrative spectacle. This restriction led to the development of an ambitious and revolutionary progression system that would be guided by how players wanted to play, and this system would dovetail with the narrative. As Firion, Maria and Guy were planned to be inexperienced youths at the start of the game, the progression system would treat them as a blank canvas. Unlike the initial game, where roles would be chosen as the game began, it meant that for Final Fantasy II, the developers wanted to create a system that focused on nurture as opposed to nature. It meant players would get to see how their players grew as the narrative advanced, but they would also get to see them grow through the way they played the game. This meant jobs were removed, and every character could wield any weapon and use any spell. At the start of the game, they would be novices in every area. The unique progression element was then that the more they performed certain actions, the more proficient they would become. For example, if one of the characters used magic on a regular basis, they would not only see their MP pool naturally increase, enabling them to cast more spells or more powerful variants, but the spells they used more often would also become stronger and more effective at their function. Likewise, characters who use axes would see their axe proficiency increase over time, allowing them to deal more damage when using that particular weapon type. And characters who took a lot of damage but survived would gain more health, working with the adage of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The belief was that this system would allow for much more diversity in terms of character development. Instead of being restricted to a single job or role, players could make multi-purpose characters who could be hybrids, able to tank or serve as both powerful magic and physical damage dealers. To ensure everything worked as expected, Kawasu worked closely with two Japanese programmers. Ken Narita and Kiyoshi Yoshi had both worked on the original Final Fantasy, having been drafted in to assist with the development after Nasir Jebeli struggled to understand how to implement the role-playing concepts. Kawasu would sit alongside Sakaguchi and Tanaka in the middle of the room, tweaking design concepts and plotting new ideas. They were then back-to-back with Narita and Yoshi, and although this meant feedback could be provided with maximum efficiency, it also led to a lot of arguments. Everyone was just so passionate about their work, and frustrations would arise if concepts were not implemented as intended, or vice versa, if concepts were not grounded in the realities of what was possible on the Famicom. Even though Narita and Yoshi continued to assist, and their roles were expanded due to the more complicated nature of the progression system and how that integrated into the battle scene, Jebeli would still be involved. Sakaguchi often didn't quite understand how or why Jebeli did what he did, but there was no denying his genius. Some elements introduced with the original game had not even been planned. Jebeli had just added them of his own accord after being struck by a moment of inspiration, and it was similar when working on Final Fantasy II. They did, however, encounter an unforeseen issue. As Jebeli was a foreign national, he was on a strict work visa. For previous projects, this wasn't an issue, as the development terms were quite short, and this meant the visa could be renewed between projects. As Final Fantasy II was afforded an extended period of development, when Jabelli's work visa expired, there was no time to initiate the renewal process. This was far from ideal, as Zhané was required to leave Japan and head back to the United States. As development had not been completed by this point, and Zhané was integral to the project, Square were left with a choice: try and find someone who could replace him in Japan and potentially delay the game, or do a lift and shift job, sending the core development team over to the United States so they could continue to work alongside their colleague. Due to the value of Zhané, the latter option was chosen. It's reported that 6 members of the Japanese development team flew over to the United States, and huge customs fees had to be swallowed in order to transport all of the equipment and materials they needed. Further costs were then added through the hiring of rooms in a motel near Jabelli's residence in Sacramento. In hindsight, this was beyond extreme, but it showed how dedicated everyone was to the project, and that motel became a temporary staging ground, with everyone working there throughout the day and sleeping there at night. It was an extreme situation, but by the end of this period, Final Fantasy II was in very good shape. As interest and intrigue built around the upcoming release of Final Fantasy II, Square were keen to take advantage of the situation they now found themselves in. Extra budget had been allocated throughout development. This had been used to hire new staff, spend more time on ensuring Kawazu's grand designs would manifest in a meaningful way, and even shifting development over to the United States. They would also spend more effort on debugging, with the likes of Hiroyuki Ito and Takashi Tokita drafted in to find any game-breaking errors or pitfalls. Everyone was confident, but to ensure the commercial performance of Final Fantasy II wasn't left to chance, extra budget was also assigned to marketing and improving general awareness. This saw Square featured in numerous video game publications throughout development, with Kenji Terada and Nasir Jabelli serving as the focal points due to the fame they had accrued from projects unrelated to Square or Final Fantasy. The rest of the team would then feature in video productions, with publications visiting their offices to learn more about the development process. Square would also produce a short television commercial. This commercial was very different from what you might expect today. It featured the actual developers who worked on the game playing the game, numerous pieces of concept art, and some of the music that had been composed by Nobuo Uematsu, and an alternative and unorthodox logo. Nonetheless, all of this was a strong show of intent, and it set the stage for the Japanese launch. Final Fantasy II launched in Japan on the 17th of December 1988. It was almost one exact year since the launch of the original game, and so much had happened during that time. The Famicom had continued to prosper, consolidating its position as the market-leading home console in Japan. This growth had been supported by the launch of numerous high-profile games throughout 1988, with many going on to sell more than 1 million copies. One of the biggest was Super Mario Bros. 3, but few could have predicted the meteoric rise of Dragon Quest. The third installment was by far the biggest launch of any video game in the history of Japan, and it showed just how much appetite had increased for role-playing games. Final Fantasy II was primed to take advantage, and it was perhaps for this reason that Square decided to increase its retail price. Whereas the original Final Fantasy retailed for 5,900 yen, Final Fantasy II retailed for 6,500 yen. It was a noticeable hike, but fans across the country were undeterred. In spite of heavy competition from the likes of home console releases of Tetris and the latest Pro Baseball Family Stadium title, both of which would end up selling over 1 million copies, Square's new premium project would sell much faster than its predecessor. By the end of its initial run, Final Fantasy II would end up selling just over 760,000 copies, 46% more than the original Final Fantasy. When combined with the higher price point, this made Final Fantasy II nothing short of a breakout success. Whereas the original game had generated approximately 3.1 billion yen, Final Fantasy II had generated over 5 billion. At the time, this was the equivalent of just under $50 million, and it was monumental. These strong sales were spurred on by praise from the media. Famitsu awarded Final Fantasy II a 35 out of 40, 1 point higher than the original game. The majority of the 4-person review team were impressed by the depth of the scenario and how well paced it was. They also appreciated the focus placed on the named characters. However, even though the battle system was commended, there was also criticism for how much grinding was necessary and how time-consuming some of the battles could be. Family Computer magazine also awarded Final Fantasy II a higher score than the original game. Readers of the magazine who had been surveyed scored Final Fantasy II as a 26.49 out of 30. Readers awarded the highest mark for engagement, music, and the characters, whereas the lowest marks were given for its perceived value for money and how well the game played. The critical and commercial performance of Final Fantasy II highlighted that the decision to allocate more budget was justified. In spite of there being wholesale changes made to narrative development, the battle system, and progression, it had exceeded the performance of the original game in every conceivable way. This notion was then cemented by the performance of Final Fantasy II at Famitsu's Best Hit Game Awards. The awards were published towards the start of 1990, just over a year after the game had launched in Japan. Final Fantasy II would walk away with Best Role-Playing Game and Best Scenario, but perhaps most importantly, it would win Game of the Year, known as the Grand Prize, by a landslide. The judging criteria took into consideration critical scores, fan votes, and commercial performance, and after totaling everything up, Final Fantasy II received almost 20,000 points, 4 times more than Mother and the Game Boy launch of Tetris. Square could not have asked for much more, and as they looked to the future of the brand, the success of Final Fantasy II had galvanized the team and emboldened their choices. Its success also opened up numerous doors, and one of those doors was related to international expansion. Square had dipped their toes into the North American market throughout 1987, but they had never taken the primary risk. Like some other Japanese publishers, this risk was always deferred to specialists who would attempt to localize only their biggest properties. In the case of Square, the North American release of Tomodachi Daisuken would be handled by Acclaim, and Highway Star would be handled by Nintendo. Each game would be renamed as part of the localization process. Tomodachi Daisuken would become known as the 3D Battles of World Runner, and Highway Star was changed to Rad Racer. And by launching in these new markets, there was the potential to appeal to new audiences and bring in huge volumes of sales. Rad Racer, for example, resonated with international audiences in a way that Highway Star never had. This led to well over 1 million copies being sold in international markets, and it became a favourite for Nintendo whenever they wanted to showcase their system. Both of the games chosen for localization had been overseen by Sakaguchi, and it meant the original Final Fantasy would be the next logical choice for localization based on how well it had performed in Japan. But the sheer scale of the game represented a significant stumbling block, as in comparison to the other more arcade-centric titles, there was huge amounts of dialogue that would need to be translated. The North American release of Final Fantasy was therefore deferred until 1990, but it would be a hit upon launch, selling 700,000 copies. This was 180,000 more copies than had been sold in Japan, and perhaps more importantly, it was more copies than Dragon Quest had managed in the same region. The success of Final Fantasy was then followed up by the North American release of Makai Toshi Saga on the Game Boy. This was renamed to the Final Fantasy Legend to help build out the brand, something that was crucial, as Square's North American subsidiary had started work on a localized version of Final Fantasy II under the supervision of Kaoru Moriyama. By this time, Final Fantasy II had already been available in Japan for over a year, and Final Fantasy III had also become a reality. The plan was therefore to speed up work on the North American releases to capitalize on the hype that was building around the Final Fantasy brand. Such was the confidence of Square's North American subsidiary that this plan would come to fruition, that they went live with a marketing campaign that said, "We see the future as a never-ending battle." It spoke of Final Fantasy as one of the best-selling role-playing games ever released by Nintendo, and pointed to the Final Fantasy Legend as being hot on its heels. The future was then teased as being Final Fantasy II, the Final Fantasy II Legend, and even Final Fantasy III, which was shown with a conceptual box art. Everything was set up for Final Fantasy to dominate the North American market, but localization times would prove to be a significant stumbling block. Localization had never been factored into the original development roadmap of either Final Fantasy or its successor, and it meant that English releases faced an unforeseen barrier in the form of memory capacity. Both games had pushed the memory limit for their Japanese releases, as they tried to squeeze in as much content as possible for consumers to enjoy. But the English language was not quite as efficient when it came to character usage, and this meant the narrative portion of the game would take up much more memory when compared to the Japanese releases. As Final Fantasy II featured even more focus on narrative, this became a complicated problem to solve, as almost every single line of dialogue would need to be truncated without losing the essence of the story. Nonetheless, Square's North American team went about this task as best as they could, and a beta version of the game was produced. Ahead of an intended launch, further promotional assets were also created, with emphasis on a new subtitle which would see the game called Final Fantasy II: Dark Shadow over Palakia. However, due to everything taking so long, Square ended up cancelling the North American release of Final Fantasy II. By this point, the Super Famicom had already been released in Japan, and in North America, the launch of the Super Nintendo was on the horizon. As such, there was a belief that even though releasing Final Fantasy II would generate revenue for the North American division, due to how old the game would be and there being so much focus on 16-bit gaming, its performance would be undermined. Square also felt as though it could lead to confusion amongst the player base, as there would be no time to localize Final Fantasy III. As such, focus was shifted towards localizing Final Fantasy IV, which in North America would be positioned as a 16-bit follow-up to the original game and released as Final Fantasy II. Gamers in North America and Europe would not actually get to experience Final Fantasy II until almost a decade later, when it was released on the PlayStation as part of the Final Fantasy Origins collection. However, due to how much time had passed, this release was not a one-to-one port of the original game. It was instead based on a remake that had been produced a year earlier for the WonderSwan color. As Final Fantasy II only had an initial launch on the Famicom, its global sales did not match what had been achieved by the original Final Fantasy. And as it didn't make it to North American and European shores until much later, its legacy has been somewhat tarnished amongst the fanbase. In Japan, however, it broke all records associated with the franchise and won numerous accolades. And similar to the original game, it meant Square were keen to explore numerous initiatives that could enrich enjoyment of the story, the characters, and the music, beyond creating a video game that would serve as a direct successor. The release of Final Fantasy II would coincide with the launch of the official Final Fantasy store, and inside, fans would be able to find numerous pieces of merchandise that related to the original Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy II. Some of this merchandise capitalized on the general fervor around the franchise, such as All Sounds of Final Fantasy I and II, a combined soundtrack that featured music composed by Nobuo Uematsu from both games in one package. But this was only the start. Final Fantasy II, for example, would have unique pieces of merchandise produced that were much more focused. Perhaps one of the most intriguing was the Final Fantasy II Sonosheet or Flexi-Disc. Realizing that music was one of the most impressive aspects of Final Fantasy, the decision was taken to produce a promotional version of the Final Fantasy II soundtrack. This would be delivered via the Sonosheet format, and it was given to everyone who purchased issue 22 of Family Computer magazine. The Sonosheet was double-sided, containing almost 10 minutes of music across its A and B sides, and it featured some of the most impactful pieces. This included, but was not limited to, the Rebel Army theme, the Town theme, and Battle Scene 1. Similar to the original Final Fantasy, numerous books were also produced as a way of expanding the lore. 2 game books were released alongside the video game in December 1988, and another was released in the following year. But to ensure they remained appealing to both those who had played the game and those who hadn't, the books were created to be standalone offerings, and they were licensed to a variety of publishers. Futabasha, for example, published Final Fantasy II Dragon Treasures. Tokuma Shoten published Final Fantasy II Journey to Victory, and Continental Shobo published Final Fantasy II The Deadly Battle with Shogun Borgen. Each of these books would share lore with the video game, but they would take a different approach when it came to execution. Final Fantasy II Dragon Treasures, for example, was set within the exact same game world, but it served as an alternate retelling of the main story. As such, Firion was replaced as the main protagonist by a new character called Princess Marie, who was designed to be a combination of Princess Hilda and Maria. Marie's party would still include Guy, and their quest would focus on a valiant attempt to obtain the legendary magical power of the Kashuan Keep in order to defeat the evil Emperor. The next book release, Final Fantasy II Journey to Victory, would act as a side story. It would take place in and around the start of the video game, and many of Final Fantasy II's main cast would have cameos, but it would focus on the struggles of a young rebel called Mid. Mid would then be joined by Neve, Thane, and Burger as they attempted to join up with the rest of the rebel army in Fynn. The third book, Final Fantasy II Deadly Battle with Shogun Borgen, would also provide an alternate retelling of the main story, but it would propose more of a what-if scenario. In this narrative, Firion and the rest of the party were killed during the prologue by Borgen, and Deist and Mysidia had been destroyed. Borgen would have also taken command of a huge warship and was wreaking havoc, something that saw Minwu slain and Joseph declared missing. The quest was therefore focused around defeating the maniacal Borgen, and Cid and Richard would be focal points as they would help to mount some kind of resistance. In addition to this third book, throughout 1989 Square also started to produce literary works that were much grander in scale, and perhaps the most noticeable in relation to Final Fantasy II was dubbed Final Fantasy II Nightmare's Labyrinth. To show the seriousness of this particular endeavour, unlike the previous game books, which were penned by authors who were unconnected with Square, Nightmare's Labyrinth was penned by Kenji Terada, the writer of both Final Fantasy I and II, and it featured brand new artwork from Yoshitaka Amano. It was intended to be a direct novelization of the game, but it ended up being so much more. When working on the game, Terada had been asked to create a scenario based on the thoughts of Kawazu, Sakaguchi and Ishii. This had been created with consideration for the medium, but the development team were required to make changes to ensure a coherent story could be told within the character limit and cartridge size constraints of the Famicom. For the novelization, no such constraints existed. This meant that even though the main axis of the story remained the same, Terada decided to make some pretty significant adjustments. It saw concrete backstories provided for the main cast of characters, as well as Emperor Maetius, with particular focus placed around how emotionally troubled Leon was. Terada also decided to make the relationship between Firion and Maria unambiguous, revealing that they ended up together after the final fight. Much of this made complete sense, as there just hadn't been the space within the 8-bit video game for this kind of detail. However, Terada also took things further, and these changes weren't related to embellishing details. Important side characters such as Richard, Cid, and Joseph were cut, and it was revealed that the main antagonist of Final Fantasy II was in fact not Emperor Maetius. Instead, it was Satan, who had taken on Maetius' likeness after being sent to the underworld. Due to these changes, the placement of Final Fantasy II Nightmare's Labyrinth remains contentious. In some regards, it's viewed as a faithful recreation of the story that Terada wanted to tell, but it strays away from the story that Sakaguchi, Kawazu, and Ishii wanted to tell when it comes to the video game, and that has to serve as the ultimate authority. As the years went on, the influence of Final Fantasy II would be clear on numerous levels. It was, for example, the first entry in the franchise to feature chocobos. This creature would since become a prominent part of the franchise, even fronting an entire collection of spin-off games. Final Fantasy II would also see the first iteration of a character called Cid, and a character who featured the name Highwind. As a standalone entry, the game would also have a certain degree of reverence amongst the community, and this would be there to counter elements of derision that have crept in due to its unorthodox progression mechanics. These differing notions would persist as Final Fantasy II would be re-released multiple times. The first re-release came on the WonderSwan Color. A remake of the original Final Fantasy served as a launch title for the WonderSwan Color, and 50% of those who bought the console also picked up a copy. As the install base of the console was expected to grow, Square committed to remaking not just the original Final Fantasy, but its two 8-bit predecessors. In the case of Final Fantasy II, time was spent creating a host of new cutscenes that helped to add more context to the story. The development team were also able to create improved sprites and high-quality pre-rendered backgrounds, which in the case of dungeons even saw the introduction of some 2.5D graphical effects. Alongside these changes, numerous quality-of-life updates were introduced to make sure the gameplay mechanics were aligned with the 16-bit era. These included, but were not limited to, players seeing damage incurred and recovered displayed in real time, and auto-targeting. This then ensured a turn was not wasted if the planned target had already been defeated. It meant the WonderSwan Color remake of Final Fantasy II was solid, but despite there being more consoles in the hands of consumers upon its release, sales failed to match those posted by the remake of the original game. As Final Fantasy II had sold more than its predecessor on the Famicom, this must have been considered a disappointing return, and it was symptomatic of the wider negative sentiment that had grown around the game in the years following its release. To counteract this, subsequent ports of Final Fantasy II on the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance were bundled with the original game. It wouldn't be until 2007 that Final Fantasy II would receive its next major standalone release. Produced as part of the Final Fantasy 20th anniversary celebration, Final Fantasy II on the PlayStation Portable served as an amalgamation of the previous versions. It contained all of the positives with issues ironed out. Further, it also contained the Arcane Labyrinth, a series of 3 new dungeons, and the Arcane Sanctuary. The same approach was then taken for the Pixel Remaster, which was released alongside its 8-bit siblings on the 28th of July 2021. The latest release again highlighted the general trend that time has not been kind to Final Fantasy II. Whereas the majority of the Pixel remasters have received collective review averages of around 90% on Steam, Final Fantasy II languishes down at 78%. There's also been a trend towards Final Fantasy II appearing dead last whenever professional video game publications create tier lists for the mainline entries. GameSpot and The Escapist, for example, published editorial pieces after the release of Final Fantasy XVI, and Final Fantasy II ranked 15th out of 15 on one and 16th out of 16 on the other. Even the creators themselves have leaned into this, as shown by comments made by Sakaguchi during a promotional interview conducted alongside Final Fantasy XV director Hajime Tabata. None of this, however, should take anything away from what the game accomplished when it was released on the Famicom back in 1988, and everyone who contributed to its success should be proud of its achievements. And that's because it should not be understated how revolutionary Final Fantasy II was. Its predecessor had been an unexpected and welcomed success, reversing the negative trajectory Square had been on. The safe option would have been to iterate and keep things simple, so as to consolidate their position in the market. But Sakaguchi decided to trust in his team and backed the machinations of Akitoshi Kawazu. Given the relatively huge budget that was assigned to the development of Final Fantasy II, this was a huge risk to take, and had the risk not paid off, it's safe to say Final Fantasy would not be the franchise it is today. Its incredible commercial performance galvanized the team, and emboldened by its critical reception, they doubled down on their approach. From that point forward, each Final Fantasy would follow an unwritten creed. It would demand that any numbered game to feature the name Final Fantasy would be inherently unique, and it's this creed that has helped to make the franchise so special for so many people around the world in the decades that followed. As 1988 concluded, Square were almost unrecognisable from the company that had existed just 18 months prior. The success of Final Fantasy and then Final Fantasy II meant the business had gone from one that was struggling to retain talent, innovate, and generate meaningful revenue, to one that had solid foundations, a clear strategy for future growth, and a workforce who were motivated and hungry for success. Final Fantasy would be central to everything. Whereas the original game had served as a catalyst, Final Fantasy II built upon its predecessor in such a successful manner that Final Fantasy was now the central pillar holding everything together. That stability would encourage Square to experiment, but while some areas of the business were afforded time to think about releasing games into new markets and onto new consoles, others were encouraged to do what they did best, just bigger and better. This would see production start on a brand new game that was planned to be ambitious, and it would push the Famicom to its limits. That game was Final Fantasy III. As Square ventured into 1989, the company was on an upward trajectory that few could have predicted. Despite releasing just 2 games throughout 1988, their profits had never been higher, and limited staff turnover meant they could be proactive about the future. One of the critical decisions following the release of the original Final Fantasy had been to place heavy emphasis on quality over quantity. This saw many of the core development staff who worked on the original game assigned to produce a follow-up, but they were afforded more time to develop a game that was reflective of their aspirations, and additional budget was also assigned so that new team members could be hired so as to accommodate for any skill gaps that may have been present. Bold decisions were also made throughout development, with perhaps the most extreme being that there would be no narrative connection between Final Fantasy I and 2. But these decisions paid off, as when the game was released almost 1 year later, to the day, critics and fans alike were enthused by what they saw. Final Fantasy II would end up receiving strong review scores across numerous publications, and this, alongside increased marketing activities, would see the game end up selling 760,000 copies in Japan. When combined with an increased price point, this meant Final Fantasy II ended up generating over 60% more revenue than the original game, and it served as the ultimate validation for the approach that had been taken. The next logical course of action was therefore to continue with the same approach. They just needed to ensure that whatever they produced was even bigger and better than before. There was just one major challenge. The role-playing genre was undergoing a rapid transformation. The arrival of Dragon Quest in the first half of 1986 and its quick successor at the start of 1987 made the Japanese video game industry sit up and take notice. There was a common belief up until that point that narrative-driven role-playing games were not mass-market products, or that the technical requirements were too complex. Because of this, the majority of games produced in the genre were isolated to personal computers. Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura shattered that belief, as after a slow start, the first 2 Dragon Quest titles would go on to sell a combined 3.9 million copies. By this point in the life cycle of the Famicom, although there had been countless games that had managed to sell over 1 million copies, only 3 of the top 20 best-selling games had been produced by a third party, and 2 of them were associated with Dragon Quest. The success of Dragon Quest emboldened creatives at other companies all across Japan. The production of role-playing games on the Famicom had now been proven as viable from a technical perspective, and that with the right support and quality, they could become must-have games for the system. At Square, this led a young Hironobu Sakaguchi to take a bold move, but similar moves were happening at a handful of other studios too. This would lead to the creation of not just Final Fantasy, but also Phantasy Star and Shin Megami Tensei. None of them would be able to match the success of Dragon Quest, but they were strong enough in their own right, and this led to each of them selling enough copies to justify the creation of follow-ups. This cycle then continued, as following the release of Dragon Quest III and Final Fantasy II, sales grew by a considerable margin in comparison to their respective previous entries. It led to more and more studios developing their own role-playing games, but there was also a subtle shift in terms of the types of role-playing games being developed. The release of Hydlide in 1984 had created a similar effect. Numerous studios wanted to try and replicate the success of the game, and by 1987, it led to 20 different action role-playing games being released on the Famicom and its disk system peripheral, a huge increase over the previous year, which had only seen 5. But as the influence of Dragon Quest spread, focus shifted away from creating action role-playing games with real-time gameplay to creating story-driven narrative role-playing games with turn-based gameplay. To further emphasize this, between the release of Final Fantasy I and II, only Dragon Quest II and Shell Monsters Story were released within this subgenre, but after the release of Final Fantasy II, the market exploded. Some developers, such as Micronix, decided to follow the trends. This saw them transform Zoids from its first installment as a straight action game, through to being an action role-playing game with the second iteration, and the third iteration, which was actually a sequel to the second iteration, served as a turn-based role-playing game. Others, such as Ghost Lion, would end up being too derivative, and they would suffer from poor reviews and poor sales due to failing to escape from the shadow of Dragon Quest. And that was the key. Any game that was created in this ever-expanding subgenre would almost always be compared to Dragon Quest, and it meant that Square were left fighting on 2 fronts. Whereas other studios had failed, they had been able to create something that was sufficiently different from Dragon Quest. And because of this, they have been able to establish a solid foothold as one of the frontrunners in this new genre. But their ambition was not to be second best. They wanted to stand toe-to-toe with Dragon Quest, and based on the sales of Final Fantasy II in comparison to Dragon Quest III, they still had a long way to go. The other fight was against the numerous other challengers. Even though Square's ambition was to catch and one day overtake Dragon Quest, they also had to be mindful of what other companies were doing. Even Nintendo had started to move in on the genre, developing their own role-playing games such as Earthbound Beginnings, which managed to sell almost 400,000 copies. With a strong foundation established following the release of Final Fantasy II, Square opted to adjust their business strategy and development pipeline. They would still place a high degree of importance on the Final Fantasy franchise, and there would still be room for the creation of experimental titles such as Hanjaku Hero, but the former objective was enhanced and the latter was refined, and a new objective was added to the equation in relation to expansion. This meant that whereas Hanjaku Hero was developed as a quirky, low-budget foray into a genre that was unorthodox, Square's next low-budget game, called Square's Tom Sawyer, would be a bit safer. Instead of coming up with an original concept, this project would be a reimagining of Mark Twain's famous story. Square commissioned a freelance writer called Gojin Komori to pen the scenario, and to ensure development time was minimal, it was produced as a simple role-playing game. Alongside this, Square started to take the North American market more seriously. Armed with a capital investment of $500,000, Squaresoft Incorporated was established in March of 1989 as a wholly owned subsidiary. Square had dipped their toes into this market before, but they had always avoided taking the primary risk by partnering with companies such as Acclaim and Nintendo. They would still take this approach for the English release of the original Final Fantasy, but Squaresoft Incorporated was tasked with taking responsibility for the localized releases of smaller titles, such as King's Knight. The ambition here was to grow and learn. Square believed that success in North America and eventually Europe would be crucial to delivering on their long-term aspirations. They had seen how quick the market was growing and how much money consumers were spending, but they were also not oblivious to their main product being very difficult to localize, and it meant they needed contingency plans. And one of those was to make sure they simply did not repeat the mistakes of the past. On the 21st of April 1989, Nintendo launched a brand new handheld console called the Game Boy. It was an immediate hit in Japan, selling 300,000 units within the first 2 weeks of its release. And after seeing the popularity of Tetris, which had taken Japan by storm, Square decided that they wouldn't act as they had with the Famicom, and decided to make their move early. Reverting back to their olden days of chasing trends, irrespective of their own experiences and interests, the initial plan, which was proposed by the CEO, was to create a puzzle-based experience that could try to replicate Tetris. But with the team now being older and wiser, Akitoshi Kawazu and Koichi Ishii, who had been crucial to the success of the first 2 Final Fantasy games, decided to ignore their boss and play to their strengths by making a role-playing game. This decision would have a profound impact on the future of Final Fantasy, as it would lead to a split within Square. Kawazu could perhaps have been involved with multiple projects had a puzzle-based game been created for the Game Boy, as was intended, but creating a new role-playing game was a much more complicated matter. And this was further complicated by the decision being taken that even though certain elements would be similar, this new game should not attempt to simply replicate Final Fantasy. It meant that alongside development of Final Fantasy III, Square would also be producing Square's Tom Sawyer and what would become known as Saga, 2 other role-playing games. The marketplace was also now much more fluid and evolved, and Square, as a company, was growing at a rapid pace. They were attempting to increase their influence in the North American market, and the core Japanese business was not looking to stand still either, with the leadership team always on the hunt for new and innovative ways to grow. That being said, Final Fantasy III was by far the most important project being undertaken at the company, and its development, with all those elements considered, would be nothing like the development of either the original Final Fantasy nor that of Final Fantasy II. Unlike Final Fantasy II, development on Final Fantasy III was a much more straightforward affair, at least in principle. Whereas there had never been any plans to extend the franchise back in 1987, after the release of Final Fantasy II in 1988, expansion was almost certain, assuming sales matched, or indeed exceeded those posted by the first iteration. Based on this, the team already had a loose plan for what they needed to do. They knew that an original story would need to be crafted, and that this story would need to be set in an original world, focused on a brand new troupe of characters. They also knew that this original story and world then needed to come complete with lore that helped to distinguish it from the two previous games. For other elements, the team had a bit more flexibility. Ahead of work commencing on Final Fantasy II, underlying principles had been established for what design elements needed to be present in order for a game to be defined as being a Final Fantasy game. For Final Fantasy III, the team just needed to identify which principles they wanted to adopt so that they knew where they wanted to focus their efforts with regards to the evolution of existing concepts and how much time they would spend on the creation of new ones. These efforts were then aided because Final Fantasy II had been pulled together by largely the same core team. There were, of course, some changes, and the roles people fulfilled had differed between the two games. But for the most part, there had been almost no turnover, and the majority of new hires were retained. When provisional planning commenced on Final Fantasy III, that same team was ready and ripe to tackle their next challenge. But there was one major exception, and that exception was Akitoshi Kawazu. Kawazu had served as one of the key game designers on those first two games, even providing many of the fundamental concepts from which Final Fantasy II was formed. But due to the ever-increasing scope and complexity of Saga, it was decided that even though Koichi Ishii would be required to work on both projects in tandem, Kawazu would not have a significant involvement with the development of Final Fantasy III. This decision left a void that needed to be filled, but it opened the door for someone else to step up, and that someone else was Hiromichi Tanaka. Tanaka was born in Ichikawa City, but by the time he entered primary school, his family had already moved to Mitaka City and then to Katsushika City. It was around this time that he developed a keen interest in science fiction, having been sucked into the worlds of Ultraman, Ultra Q, and Astro Boy, and this led to an interest in building his own Apple II so that he could play the latest games. Tanaka did well at school and had dreams of attending the Tokyo Institute of Technology, but his family was too poor and couldn't afford the tuition, so he attended Yokohama National University instead. After arriving there, Tanaka found the degree wasn't quite what he expected. Most of the technological knowledge he'd acquired over the years was more practical, and the courses he'd enrolled in were much more related to conceptual applications. Fortunately, Tanaka was not alone in this plight, and after identifying that a classmate called Hironobu Sakaguchi was also struggling to get his head around the course material, the two became good friends. After Sakaguchi then managed to land a role at a fledgling company called Square, he was quick to try and secure a role for his friend. And so, Tanaka, despite having no more programming knowledge than Sakaguchi, managed to land a job as a programmer on some of their first games, before quickly establishing himself as a core member of the team. In the earlier days, this saw Tanaka promoted to oversee Square's B team, and prior to working on Final Fantasy, that B team worked on games such as Alpha, Crystal Dragon, and Square's licensed Aliens game. During this time, Tanaka gained a reputation for being an approachable and friendly leader, and towards the start of 1987, when each team leader was asked to propose a new project, whereas hardly anyone volunteered to support Sakaguchi's vision for a role-playing game, a much larger contingent chose to support Tanaka's project. After finishing up on development on a role-playing game called The Cursed Treasure of Cleopatra, Tanaka would end up joining the Final Fantasy team as a game designer. This represented the first time the two friends had actively worked on the same project since Square's first ever game, The Death Trap. And as one of the more experienced staff members at Square, Tanaka would continue to fulfill that role on Final Fantasy II. Alongside Sakaguchi, Tanaka would be tasked with refining gameplay concepts that had been established and ensuring everything was being pulled together according to the agreed plan and timings. But with Kawazu stepping away to work on Saga, when development started in earnest on Final Fantasy III, it was Tanaka who stepped forward to propose the new primary vision, and he would work with the wider team to ensure that everything married together. It meant there were clear roles and responsibilities. Sakaguchi, serving as director, was there to ensure the overriding vision and the essence of Final Fantasy was being maintained. But as with Final Fantasy II, even though he would provide feedback on almost every aspect of the game, much of his time and effort would be placed on working with Kenji Terada to ensure the narrative was as good as it could be. Sakaguchi then entrusted the majority of the game design elements to Tanaka, much as he had done with Kawazu on the previous iteration. That's not to say that Tanaka would be responsible for coming up with all the systems himself though. He would instead serve as the design lead. In this role, Tanaka would work closely with the likes of Ishii and Kazuhiko Aoki to evolve, refine, and establish new mechanics. But he would also be responsible for overseeing the programming team, which contained the famed Nasir Jabeli, Kiyoshi Yoshi, and Katsuhisa Higuchi, to ensure everything worked as intended, and the artists such as Kazuhiko Shibuya and Hiromi Nakada to ensure that everything looked as intended. With the benefit of succession now available to them, one of the major changes between Final Fantasy II and III was that the developers were afforded more choice when attempting to figure out what to do. They could see which of the design elements had resonated most with critics and players across the two installments, and then decide which one should be iterated and evolved upon, and which one should be ditched. And this was an important distinction, as even though Final Fantasy II had received more critical praise than its predecessor, and also won plaudits for its narrative, not everything had landed as intended. Perhaps the most notable example of this was the unorthodox progression system. The intention had been to develop a system that promoted the player nurturing their characters and moulding them into the best versions of whatever the player wanted them to be. This was the antithesis of many other role-playing games being released at the time, as they often mandated large portions of progression. The original Final Fantasy, for example, offered players a choice of jobs when embarking on their quest, but almost every other major decision after that point was predicated. Throughout the development of Final Fantasy II, the team felt they had stumbled upon an innovative solution to this problem, but once the game was released, some of the pitfalls of the approach were laid bare. And one of the main causes was an innocuous decision relating to the sleep status effect. This status was introduced in the original Final Fantasy as a way of preventing the affected unit from taking an action until they woke up after a set period of time. To evolve the mechanic and make it more interactive, Kawazu thought it would make sense for any affected units to wake up if they also took physical damage, just as they would in real life. But this led to players figuring out that if they hurt their own party, they could use this as a quick way to increase their own HP. This discovery opened Pandora's box. Instead of playing the game as intended and progressing characters through the nurturing system, many players invested more time into figuring out the optimum ways to abuse and exploit the game. How players reacted to the Final Fantasy II progression mechanic highlighted the pitfalls of developing, as Kawazu would later call it, an eclectic system. And as this was very much Kawazu's brainchild, and he was no longer assigned as an active contributor on Final Fantasy III, the decision was taken to ditch almost the entire system and revert back to something they were much more comfortable with, and in truth, was much more simple. The obvious choice was therefore jobs. When working on the original Final Fantasy, Ishii had created the initial notion of job classes. The idea was that by providing this choice at the start of the adventure, they would allow the player to create their own party, as opposed to the game being focused on a single predetermined hero or heroine. They weren't too worried about balancing. Instead, the system was developed with the notion of just letting people figure things out so that they could create their own challenges. If people wanted to try and defeat the game with a party of 4 white mages, then more power to them. There were pros and cons to this approach, just as there was with the system that Kawazu had developed for Final Fantasy II. And so, even though Final Fantasy III did revert back to using jobs, there was a real desire to modify and evolve the system. One of the crucial decisions in this regard was made by Sakaguchi. Struck by a moment of inspiration one evening, Sakaguchi envisioned what would become the job chain system. The next day, he told the rest of the team his plan, and at first they were unconvinced. But after exploring the possibilities, they started to understand the power housed within the mechanic. Not only would it give players more choice as the game progressed, as they would no longer be restricted to just a single job per character, it would have a fundamental impact on how the rest of the game functioned. For example, with players having the ability to change jobs as the story progressed, there was no longer a requirement for the player to select a job at the beginning of the adventure. The decision to implement a job change system also influenced how the story was developed, as there needed to be a logical way for new jobs to be acquired. But perhaps the area that was affected the most was the jobs themselves, and this related to the quantity of jobs, but also how they functioned. In the original game, there were just 6 jobs, 12 if you consider the upgraded jobs as being independent. This was pretty common amongst similar games, with Ultima 4 and Wizardry 5 having 8 classes, and Dragon Quest III having 8 vocations. But to ensure Final Fantasy III stood out against its contemporaries, the developers decided to up the ante. Throughout development, over 30 different jobs were considered for inclusion in the final product, and while some were intended to serve as derivative upgrades, such as the Monk, Supermonk and Hypermonk, others, such as the Geomancer and Evoker, were much more original. This originality would be given the chance to shine through unique applications that could be used via the expanded command menu. In the original Final Fantasy, each character had access to the same 5 commands: fight, magic, drink, item, and run. And in Final Fantasy II, this was reduced down to just 4 options following the removal of drink. In Final Fantasy III, the original plan was to replicate this and have the jobs distinguishable based on a combination of equipment and magic restrictions, as well as their visual style. But given the volume of jobs they wanted to feature, it became clear that this would not be sufficient enough for many of them to be seen as unique. And so, even though there would still only be 4 commands available for the player to use each turn, exclusive commands were created that aligned with expected job characteristics. Thieves, for example, would be able to use the steal command, while scholars had access to scan. In total, this meant there were 17 different commands that had the potential to appear, and when combined with spellcasting and equipment restrictions and the ability to change between any of the unlocked jobs at any point during a playthrough, this made Final Fantasy III a much more strategic game than either of the 2 previous iterations. This notion would be pushed even further via the job adjustment phase mechanic. The job change system introduced a lot of freedom to the player, something that was emphasised by the ability to change jobs without the level being reset. But even though this was quite liberating in comparison to the original game, the developers also wanted to try and dissuade players from switching jobs on a whim, so they created some restrictions. Inheriting from traditional Western role-playing games, each job was placed on a chart, one axis related to the job's reliance on physical strength or magical affinity to deal damage, and the other related to how lawful or chaotic the job was deemed to be from a lore perspective. This would see jobs vary from extreme magical and lawful alignment, such as the clergyman, which would later become known as the devout, through to extreme physical and chaotic alignment in the form of the samurai, a job that was eventually cut. The role of the job adjustment phase mechanic was then to identify where the current and proposed jobs sat on the chart in relation to each other, and establish how far apart they were based on those 2 criteria. This distance would then create a penalty, which would reduce the character's primary stats by 12.5%, and the duration of this penalty would be based on the established distance. It was designed so that this number could never go higher than 10 encounters, so as to not penalise the player too heavily. But the primary role of the mechanic was to encourage players to stay in their lane, so to speak. They didn't want to see too many instances where players were changing jobs that were too different from one another, from both a functional or thematic perspective. If a character was a summoner by trade, then it would make sense for them to transition to being a sage, but not a dragoon or a ninja. The inclusion of so many different jobs, and so many unique mechanics then related to those jobs, highlighted the ambition of the development team to ensure that Final Fantasy III left nothing on the table. This had been one of the main development mantras ever since the original Final Fantasy was being developed. But in the case of Final Fantasy III, it meant even more, as rumours were already circling that Nintendo were on the cusp of releasing their next major home console. And if that were the case, Final Fantasy III could well be the last iteration of the franchise to appear on the Famicom. Based on this, Square opted to use a different memory management controller. Final Fantasy II and III had been developed using the MMC-1. This chip came into production during the first half of 1987, and it was designed to replace the Unrom game pack. Alongside doubling the storage capacity from 128KB to 256KB, the introduction of the memory management controllers was a game changer in terms of speed and efficiency of computations. This allowed programmers to scroll in different directions in a more simple manner, and through the use of a battery, game progress could be saved from one session to the next. They were also smaller and cheaper to produce than the Unrom game pack, and even though Nintendo produced other memory management controllers as the Famicom continued to evolve, the MMC-1 would be used on some of the biggest games, including, but not limited to, Metroid, Mega Man 2, and The Legend of Zelda. By late 1988, Nintendo had started to roll out the MMC-3. This doubled the storage again from 256KB to 512KB. and it introduced innovations such as reducing the overheads associated with split-screen scrolling. With so much extra storage to play with, and with even more efficiency of computations afforded, the developers working on Final Fantasy III started to explore numerous possibilities. Some of these possibilities related to improved graphical fidelity and more jobs and enemies, which facilitated the production of even more graphical assets. But this also extended to audio, as by using the MMC3, much better sound effects could be created. And Square was so passionate about this particular area that they even created an entire dedicated team which contained the likes of Takashi Tokita, Hiroyuki Ito, and Toshiyuki Inoue. But the benefit of this space would also be felt elsewhere, as similar to the expansion of jobs and the introduction of the job change mechanic, ideas that were not possible before started to become a reality. Towards the start of development, core members of the team wrote down an unending stream of ideas they wanted to explore, with the premise being that there should be no limits placed on creativity. As development commenced and continued, they would then refer back to this list of ideas to see which ones could be implemented based on how the game was developing from both a narrative but also a mechanical perspective. One of the ideas they began to explore from the outset related to creating an integrated battle scene. Due to memory restrictions, the battle scene had always been split into specific areas dedicated to enemies, the party, and the user interface. They would work in tandem, but could not visually overlap or interact with each other. This was quite obvious within the original Final Fantasy, but Final Fantasy II had the same restrictions. The graphic designers just did a much better job of blurring the lines. With Final Fantasy III no longer suffering from those same memory restrictions, the battle scene became integrated, something that enabled the different components to interact with each other in a manner that just had not been seen before. This opened up a lot of possibilities, but perhaps the most important one was the idea that the party should gain access to much larger sprites. Of the many ideas that were jotted down during the early phases of development, one of them related to creating a mechanic where the party could enlist monsters that would then fight on their behalf. Ishii had wanted to implement a similar mechanic within the two previous games, but couldn't find a way to do so. And the continued desire to have it feature in Final Fantasy III was perhaps driven by Aoki managing to use a similar mechanic within Hanjaku Hero. In that game, players had the chance to call upon powerful monsters to aid them in combat, and there was a huge array available, including the likes of Asura, Golem, and Typhon. But the system was quite complex. Each character would have access to different summons, and they would become progressively weaker after each use. It was also possible for the character to lose the ability to summon monsters should their summon be defeated. For Final Fantasy III, once it became clear that they could blend the battle scene, Tanaka decided that they could incorporate the monster versus monster scenario, but it would need to be made much simpler. Instead of there being a huge array of summons available to the player, there would only be 8, and those 8 would only be accessible to the Evoker, Summoner, and Sage jobs. To ensure they delivered a suitable visual spectacle, Square commissioned Yoshitaka Amano to draw his interpretations of what these summons would look like. What he came back with were elaborate and bold designs, and it was then the responsibility of Kazuko Shibuya, who had now been working on pixel art at Square for some time, to translate these masterful pieces of artwork into pixelated masterpieces that retained the same essence. With these elements coming together in a manner that everyone was happy with, thoughts then progressed as to how they could make this design element really stand out. And one of the ways they came up with was to provide high-class animation that would accompany the appearance of each summon. And this would perhaps be best evidenced with Odin. After much debate, it was decided that Odin should attack enemies with a sword as opposed to a spear, and that his move should be called Zantetsuken, and that it should deliver a swift, instant kill. The pizzazz would come via the screen literally splitting in half, but this was an incredibly complicated visual effect to achieve on the Famicom. When working on Rad Racer, the team had developed a way to animate the road turning that would use individual scan lines, and they then used a similar technique for Odin's screen split. But because they could never predict when players would use Odin, if ever, they made modifications that would affect the entire battle scene, as they had to ensure the effect always worked as intended and there weren't any visual oddities. These modifications would therefore impact every single encounter in the game, and it meant that monsters always had to appear in front of a black background and that the scenery was always located on the top half of the screen. To accomplish all of this, the development team were afforded much more time than they were for either of the two previous iterations. But with the scale of the product ballooning as a result, it meant much more time had to be placed around ensuring everything worked as intended. Even though there was still no notion of having a dedicated quality assurance team, quality assurance was still very important. It's just that the expectation was that people from all over the company, irrespective of their role, would muck in to help identify issues, and they would be required to playtest the game over and over again until everyone was satisfied with the final product. It saw the likes of Yusuke Hirata and Hisashi Suzuki, who were much more involved with the business side of Square's operation, conscripted to help, and this led to a fateful decision. According to Sakaguchi, Suzuki was responsible for playtesting the Crystal Tower. This dungeon was meant to serve as the final test, and the original intention was to have it be challenging, but also not too hard. Having played through the dungeon a not insignificant number of times, Suzuki became very efficient with progressing in an array of different scenarios, and as a result, he provided feedback stating that the dungeon was far too easy, and that the lack of challenge was starting to become demotivating. In response, Sakaguchi made quite an extreme decision. Negating that Suzuki only felt this way due to his experience, Sakaguchi decided to increase the challenge for everyone by removing the planned save and rest location at the dungeon's midpoint. Final Fantasy III would also suffer from the same unfortunate scenario as Final Fantasy II, as their main programmer, Nasir Jebeli, had his visa expire during development. The value of Jebeli was not in question. He had incredible ability and loved to try and surprise the game designers by producing elements that were far beyond their expectations. This was evidenced numerous times during the development of the two previous Final Fantasy games, and with even more possibilities this time around, due to them using the MMC3, Jebeli just wanted to have fun. One instance related to the airship. With there being more space, the developers decided to incorporate multiple airships, and to differentiate them, one idea was to have them travel at different speeds. Tanaka showed Jebeli an example of what they wanted, which was found in a game called Zhané. Jebeli then returned with the exact implementation the very next day, but he had taken it even further by creating hyperspeed. This time, Jebeli's visa expired when there was around 2 months of development remaining until the game was due to be mastered. So to ensure work could continue on Final Fantasy III with minimal disruption, the core development team again travelled back to San Francisco and worked out of a motel. The only difference this time was that the equipment they were bringing over was more sophisticated, and it led to Sakaguchi being held up in customs as he was required to explain exactly what they were doing in the country and why they needed to bring so much advanced technology with them. With Square now gearing up to launch their third Final Fantasy game, internal expectations were rather different. Whereas with the two previous games there was no real benchmark or precedent based on what they were attempting to do, ahead of the launch of Final Fantasy III, employees at Square now had both of those factors available to consider, and it meant there were very real expectations in terms of critical and commercial performance. The reality was that Final Fantasy was now an established brand, so the way the game was to be marketed had to change in order to reflect this newfound status, and this would have a significant impact on how Final Fantasy III was marketed in Japan. Even though the marketing department at Square would use similar strategies to what they had done with the two previous games, this newfound status and associated increases in marketing budget meant they were able to flex some much larger muscles and take advantage of tactics that were previously unavailable to them. Final Fantasy III was announced to the Japanese public in September of 1989, 7 months before its eventual launch, and the announcement was two-pronged. Alongside a very unconventional print advertising campaign which showed the words Final Fantasy III on top of some coloured bubbles, there was also a 4-page featurette. This had thoughts from key creators working on the project, concept art for new animals such as the Chocobo, and a look at some of the new jobs. A few months later, Square would then attend a brand new trade show called Shoshinkai as an exhibitor, and Final Fantasy III would be on display. Due to the ongoing success of the Famicom and the fervour surrounding the Game Boy, Nintendo sought new ways to consolidate and expand their influence over the Japanese video games industry. This led to them creating their own trade-only conference where wholesalers, journalists, publishers and developers could come together to discuss everything Nintendo. For developers and publishers, this served as a fantastic way to showcase any upcoming software they were working on, as if a positive impression was made, there was the potential to have journalists produce more coverage and for retailers to increase their planned shipments. The event took place on the 21st and 22nd of November 1989, and it was hosted in Tokyo at what is now known as the Tokyo Ryutsu Center. This event was also notable as the president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, hosted a keynote speech where he lamented the increase in uninteresting shovelware that was starting to be produced, challenging developers to create less games but of higher quality. And to dovetail with this notion, there was a panel called The Future of Famicom Software, which featured Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura of Dragon Quest fame, but also the director of Mother, Shigesato Itoi. In total, there were 53 different exhibitors showing off 144 different games, and alongside Dragon Quest IV, which was seen as the premium property, Final Fantasy III was also there on the show floor for attendees to play. Throughout this time, the game would continue to have a presence in the Japanese media. When Famitsu published their first magazine of the year in 1990, just months after the game had been announced, Final Fantasy III was positioned as the second most anticipated property, sitting only behind Dragon Quest IV. And this was a notable accomplishment, as while Dragon Quest IV had a release date which was only 2 months away, Square had still not announced when Final Fantasy III would be available for people to play. The other fascinating element was that both Dragon Quest IV and Final Fantasy III were much more anticipated than the Japanese Famicom port of Wizardry 3, a game that had served as one of the main points of inspiration for both of them. After the release date was revealed and mere weeks remained until launch, Final Fantasy III became the game on everyone's lips. And to ensure momentum was maintained, prominent figures associated with development, including Yoshitaka Amano, Kenji Terada, Nobuo Uematsu, and Nasir Jabeli, would all speak to the media. Jabeli, for example, was a fascinating individual due to his renown as a programmer. Japanese publications would love the chance to talk with him, as they had the potential to gain insight into other markets, and would often ask questions about how Japanese games differed from ones developed in North America, especially role-playing games. The other major promotional tool that Square could leverage was the box art. For both the original Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy II, they had leaned on the considerable talent of Amano to create something that would be inspiring to would-be purchasers. And the same approach was adopted for Final Fantasy III. This time, however, the outline and framework was provided by Kazuko Shibuya. Having been responsible for working on many of the enemy sprites found in the original 2 games, Shibuya had formed a strong working relationship with Amano. At first, this just meant Shibuya was the one assigned to pick up drawings from Amano's house as they lived near each other. But as they worked on more and more games together, the pair discussed how best to transition work from one medium to the other, and sometimes this involved a lot of creative liberties being taken. For example, the concept art provided for Cloud of Darkness would not have worked in-game, so Shibuya tried her best to retain the essence of the antagonist for what would end up being a very different looking sprite. This worked both ways, however, as when working on promotional assets, Sakaguchi used Shibuya's more traditional artistic talents to create a concept for the box art. This was then passed over to Amano, who used the concept as inspiration for the final version. Final Fantasy III launched in Japan on the 27th of April 1990. Unlike the 2 previous releases, which had been just a year apart, this saw Final Fantasy III launch 16 months after its predecessor. But Square were not alone in taking this approach of affording more time to its developers. After releasing the original Dragon Quest and its 2 successors in the space of just 20 months, Dragon Quest IV was given almost a longer development time than those 3 games combined. This saw a full 2 years pass between the release of Dragon Quest III and IV, but sales were not hindered, at least in the short term, as Dragon Quest IV sold 1.3 million copies within just 1 hour of its release. It was expected that Final Fantasy III would follow the same trend, and so, due to the huge levels of anticipation and the increased production costs owing to them using the MMC3, the decision was taken to increase the retail price. This jumped up by over 29%, from 6,500 yen to 8,400 yen. But even though this was a significant increase, it was par for the course, as Dragon Quest IV had retailed for 8,500 yen just a few months before. This uptick in retail price led to a surge in revenue for both brands. In the case of Dragon Quest IV, even though it sold less copies than its predecessor, more revenue was generated. Final Fantasy III followed suit, but the trend was far more extreme. Whereas Dragon Quest IV had sold 700,000 copies less than its predecessor, Final Fantasy III became the first game in the franchise to sell over 1 million copies by selling almost 700,000 more copies than its predecessor. And when combined with the increased retail price, this saw Final Fantasy III generate 11.8 billion yen, or the equivalent of over $70 million at the time. This figure represented a 138% increase in revenue compared to the previous game. And such was the size of this increase that Final Fantasy as a brand could no longer be considered a pretender. There was still a hefty gap to close when compared to Dragon Quest, but it no longer seemed insurmountable, and this notion was reflected amongst critics. Famitsu awarded Final Fantasy III a 36 out of 40, placing the game within their Platinum Hall of Fame. This was the highest score awarded to a Final Fantasy game to date, with the two previous games being scored 34 and 35 out of 40 respectively, and it was a strong sign of the incremental improvements that were being made. Praise was given for how comprehensive and playable the job change system was, and its visuals were considered on par, if not superior, to Dragon Quest IV. The main criticisms were around the pacing of the story and the dungeons, with the reviewers noting that they often felt far too long and could have benefited from midway recovery points. Family Computer Magazine followed suit, with their readers scoring Final Fantasy III on average as a 26.6 out of 30. This was a marginal improvement over the 26.49 awarded to Final Fantasy II, but perhaps most importantly, it was higher than Dragon Quest IV, which was awarded a 25.34. Almost every individual area, including story, music, and design, scored higher than its predecessor. But perhaps due to the increased price point, value for money was the area where fans posited a more negative stance. And this was an interesting point, as value for money was where Dragon Quest IV had scored highest. These views were then ratified when each publication went to market with their year-end rewards. Famitsu placed Dragon Quest IV as their Game of the Year, with Final Fantasy III landing in the second spot. But Family Computer Magazine ranked them the other way around, with Final Fantasy III taking the win in their Famicom category. This was a notable victory, and it was made all the more sweet, as Saga, the offshoot game developed for the Game Boy by Kawazu Onishi, was also awarded Game Boy Game of the Year. This was all fantastic news for the Final Fantasy brand in Japan, but outside of Japan, everything would end up being quite lopsided. Not long after Final Fantasy III had been released in Japan, the original Final Fantasy was released in North America. It performed much better than expected and led to initial explorations into how Final Fantasy II and III could be localized. Square North America even produced promotional materials that hinted that Final Fantasy III would be releasing in that territory. But due to how fast-paced everything needed to be, and with the requirement of them needing to navigate their first major home console transition, Square just couldn't keep up with the demand. Even though they had the ambition to release localized versions of Final Fantasy II and III, they just couldn't justify the resources, and harsh decisions had to be made around where they felt the most growth could be achieved. After careful consideration, this meant refocusing their efforts on the production of more games for their Japanese market, and cancelling any plans they had to bring their Final Fantasy back catalogue on the Famicom to North America and other Western territories. The decision to have Final Fantasy III stay as a Japanese exclusive during the 8-bit era would have a significant impact on the perception and performance of the game on a global scale. And this would be further compounded as the years passed, as design decisions taken around the sheer volume of content included made it difficult to have it represented on more modern systems in the same way as Final Fantasy I and II. But in Japan, Final Fantasy III was very much the golden child. Its critical and commercial performance were much higher than either of the two previous games, and Square were keen to take advantage of the ever-expanding interest around their now multi-million unit selling franchise. As with the two previous games, this would come through a combination of initiatives that related to merchandising. But with focus split in numerous ways, the amount of products produced was nowhere near as grandiose as with the previous games. Alongside the production of numerous branded telephone cards, jigsaw puzzles, and posters, this saw a standalone original soundtrack released. But Very similar to the original Final Fantasy, this soundtrack did not arrive at launch, and fans would have to wait over a year until they could listen to music from the game on either a cassette tape or CD without having to boot up the game itself. According to Nobuo Uematsu, the plan had always been to release the album much closer to launch, but it kept being postponed due to various circumstances that were never revealed. Because of these delays, Uematsu believed the album would never be released, but as fan demand was so persistent, an original sound version was released on the 15th of July 1991. It would contain 44 tracks, and to ensure it was authentic to the Final Fantasy III experience, the soundtrack even included the short piano lessons. These were extra special as they were recorded based on actual performances by Hiroyuki Ito, and the errors were kept in to ensure the track sounded genuine. That's not to say audio files were left unserviced, however, as a month after Final Fantasy III had launched, Square went to market with Final Fantasy III Legend of the Eternal Wind. Unlike the majority of their previous audio releases, this album had a specific focus on arrangements. And because of this, the vibe, fidelity, and general tone of the album was very different from what was being produced at the time. The first track, for example, called The Evil Power of the Underworld, served as an arrangement of the prelude, an original track written by Uematsu, and The Crystal Cave. And because Uematsu was no longer limited by the constraints of the Famicom, this meant the arrangements he produced featured additional layers of complexity in terms of the number and quality of the samples being used, and the subsequent harmonies that could be created. 7 tracks were produced for the album, and each was designed to tell a story. In the initial sense, this was delivered by actual narration, provided in English by Jeff Levy. The idea was to establish the setting, with a view to introducing the focal point of the music featured in the track. Each track itself would then combine numerous pieces of music together to create a unique arrangement. But the curious element here was that not all of the music was from Final Fantasy III. As with The Evil Power of the Underworld, some tracks used were original pieces of music that had never and would never feature in a Final Fantasy game, while others featured music from previous games. Track 5, dubbed Ebb and Flow, would, for example, feature Matoya's Cave from the original Final Fantasy. Due to the intrigue around the album, when it was released, it peaked at number 18 in the Japanese Oricon charts and reportedly sold over 32,000 copies. For each of the previous 2 games, Square had produced numerous books. Some of them had been game books, while others had served as alternate retellings or prequels. Many of these expansions were written by external partners under the supervision of Square, but the Final Fantasy II novelization was handled by the actual writer of the in-game script, Kenji Terada. For Final Fantasy III, Terada would be again commissioned to work on a piece of literature, but this time it was not a straight novelization. Instead, a 3-part manga called Final Fantasy III Legend of the Eternal Wind was created in collaboration with Dragon Comics, and it served as an alternate retelling. Whereas in the original game the heroes were positioned as nameless warriors of light, for the manga they were given names Muchi, Doug, Bowie, and Melfi. Issue 1, which was released in October of 1991, would show how they all came together, while also introducing known characters such as Princess Sarah and Cid. Issue 2, which was published in April of 1992, would then focus on their battle against Hein, which would include appearances from Ifrit and a male Shiva. And Issue 3, which was published in September of 1992, would see the Warriors of Light unite with Unai and Doga as they attempted to save the world. Throughout, they would interact with a plethora of characters, some of which were featured within the actual game, but there were others who were created fresh for the manga. That such media was able to exist, and that Final Fantasy III sold so many copies upon release, showed the wider impact of this specific game in comparison to the 2 previous entries. Square knew that they had a winner on their hands, and in Japan, Final Fantasy III was the game that had solidified Final Fantasy as a mega franchise. But as that franchise built out over the next decade, and the commercialization and identification of supplemental sources of revenue became more prevalent, Final Fantasy III would often be excluded. Part of this was because of its impact being superseded by subsequent games that achieved even greater feats, but there was also a notion of Final Fantasy III being a victim of its own success. The first instance of this phenomenon was seen around the turn of the millennium. Despite releasing numerous high-profile video games, Square had been crippled from a financial perspective by the dismal box office performance of Final Fantasy The Spirit Within. To try and turn the fortunes of the business around, additional revenue streams were explored, and it was for this reason that Square entered into a dialogue with Bandai about porting older Final Fantasy games to their upcoming handheld console, the WonderSwan Color. After numerous discussions, Square signed a deal that would see them commit to releasing their 3 8-bit Final Fantasy games on the WonderSwan Color, and instead of being straight ports, they would be remade from the ground up to take advantage of the system's capabilities. The original Final Fantasy subsequently released as a launch title on the 9th of December 2000. Final Fantasy II then released a year later. Due to their success, the deal was expanded, and Final Fantasy IV then released on the WonderSwan Color towards the start of 2002. But the remade version of Final Fantasy III never materialized. According to reports, the game was in a playable state, but Square had delayed publishing the game for undisclosed reasons. Towards the start of 2003, it was rumoured that Bandai had even purchased the rights to publish the game on their own. But as production of the WonderSwan Color had ceased by this point, with the handheld system not having managed to perform well enough against Nintendo's own offering, Bandai also decided not to push forward. Hiromichi Tanaka would later clarify that whereas remaking the first 2 Final Fantasy games, and indeed Final Fantasy IV, was quite straightforward, replicating the process for Final Fantasy III was not. The issue came with how much content was crammed in. When Final Fantasy III was produced for the Famicom, the team had stretched the memory allocation to the absolute limit. But every single one of those audio and visual assets would need to be recreated for the WonderSwan Color version. The challenge was therefore that if they wanted to keep everything consistent across all 3 games, then there just wasn't enough storage capacity available for them to make that a reality. And even if there was, the other challenge was around manpower, as people would need to be assigned to actually recreate those assets. Final Fantasy III would then suffer a similar fate on the Game Boy Advance. Every 8-bit and 16-bit Final Fantasy would be released on this system, with the only exceptions being Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Final Fantasy 1 and 2 would release as the Dawn of Souls double pack, whereas Final Fantasy 4, 5 and 6 would have the Advance tagline. But even though work was complete on Final Fantasy 3 Advance, with the initial plan being to carry over assets that had already been completed for the WonderSwan Color remake, similar problems were encountered yet again around storage. By this point, Square had now merged with Enix to form Square Enix, and Nintendo were back as an ally, having spent years as an estranged partner. As they understood the value of Final Fantasy III to the Japanese market, Nintendo suggested that instead of spending their time on a 16-bit remake, it would perhaps be more prudent to invest their time into a full-on 3D remake that could leverage the technical capabilities of their upcoming console, the Nintendo DS. Tanaka would return for the production, serving as both director and executive producer, as he wanted to ensure that this next evolution for Final Fantasy III was both faithful and adaptive in the right way. As a consequence, even though the majority of the elements were retained, narrative changes were also made, such as giving names to the 4 protagonists, and the job system was redesigned and rebalanced. New functionality was also added to take advantage of the Nintendo DS's unique hardware capabilities. The Nintendo DS remake of Final Fantasy III would then end up launching on the 24th of August 2006, some 16 years after the original game. Because so much time had passed, Square Enix had estimated that the game would only sell around 350,000 units during its lifetime in Japan, but when the game launched, those estimations were smashed. Final Fantasy III sold 501,701 copies during its first week on sale, becoming the second fastest selling game on the Nintendo DS. Only New Super Mario Bros. Had managed to sell more copies in such a short space of time. Over its lifetime, the Final Fantasy III remake would end up selling just over 1 million copies in Japan. This ranked it as the 32nd best-selling DS game in that region and the best-selling Final Fantasy game to release on that system by some margin. And as Final Fantasy III had never been released before outside of Japan, it also sold well in North America and Europe, with approximately 1 million copies being sold across the 2 regions. That such strong sales were seen after such a long absence highlighted the strength of Final Fantasy III, and it showed how solid the foundations of the game were when it was produced for the Famicom. As had been the case with both the original Final Fantasy and its successor, Sakaguchi had placed a huge amount of faith in his team. And with Kawazu moving away to forge his own path, this saw Tanaka required to step up and take on the mantle. armed with a larger budget, a larger team, and even more time. This saw them create a game that was far more detailed and intricate than either of the two previous iterations. And such was the strength of the game that sales skyrocketed, and critics and fans saw it as a legitimate rival to Dragon Quest IV. But even though everything seemed to be moving in a positive direction for Final Fantasy, the release of Final Fantasy III brought about significant internal changes. Some of these were driven by Square's attempts to adapt to the looming release of the Super Famicom, while others were brought about by personal ambition. These changes would require that Final Fantasy evolve yet again, but they would set the franchise on a brand new path that would see it reach new heights, and not just in Japan, but on a global scale. Before closing this video out, I'd like to give a big thank you to our Patreon supporters for helping to fund the creation of this video. Without their support, this video would not exist in its current form. Funds have been spent on paying for external support that's needed to edit this video to a high standard, but Patreon supporters have been very much at the heart of the process, helping to shape the documentary as it has built out over the past year. To be blunt, producing this type of long-form content also needs money. So if you enjoy the content and are excited to see the equivalent videos being produced for Final Fantasy IV, 5 and 6, please do consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/ffunion. I'd also like to thank Zhané, the editor of this video, who does such a fantastic job of bringing my words to life. And John Oath and TPR also deserve a special thanks for allowing us to use their musical arrangements throughout the content that we produce in general. If you've ever enjoyed the music you've heard in our videos, please check them out on Spotify and YouTube. Lastly, I'd like to thank the amazing community. Whether it's watching our videos, liking them, sharing them around, and even commenting, you continue to show up and make producing these videos worthwhile. Producing videos like this is always a huge risk because they take so long to research, write, and edit. But it's where we want the channel to go, and we can't wait to show you the complete history of Final Fantasy IV, hopefully in a couple of months. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Sukan TDK, who are super special Onion Eye supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.